I managed to slip out of literature class without any more questions due to Austin being half asleep by the end of class. At first I thought the skinny kid, Rogers, was following me, but he turned left at the bottom of the stairs instead of right. My second class of the day was math, 7th grade math. Yes, I'm Asian, an Asian who doesn't do well with math. At least, not at the level when you do things with negative numbers and start using letters. I'm not going to be an engineer or even an accountant. Adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying, I got it. I'm even good at it, but unless you're going into a field when you need more than that, high school level math should be either an option for those who want to take it or else they should be able to skip it. Instead, I have to take advanced math, then pre-algebra in the spring, and then I have to take 3 more math classes to get through high school. But I guess if I have to take these classes, I have to at least do them so well that my younger sister will have to work even harder at it to match my grades. And she hates math even more than I do. For spite's sake, I will excel. Third period was gym, and I thought math was a waste of my time. There I was in my brand new gym clothes, green sweat shorts, and a red polo shirt, all ready to show up to a very limited degree, and, Kane, you're benched due to your doctor's note. I look at Coach Adams in disbelief. What? The bald middle-aged guy nodded at me and waved me off. You're in study hall at the old gym until the end of the hour. You still get a credit for gym, but you're on independent study. Scoot. Then he winked at me before turning around to blow his whistle at the rest of my class. Rogers and Austin were waiting outside the doors I had been waved to. Both of them were in sweats, the larger boy in a fairly new set of sweatpants and a shirt he had overgrown, while the smaller boy, Rogers, was in a set of worn and patched cut-off black sweatpants and a tank top that showed off his thin but wiry arms. He waved at me. Ryan Rogers, and you know Austin. We figured that since you got a note from Dr. Fictus as well, you might need some directions to the old gym. Austin grunted at me and turned to walk away. I nodded at Ryan and thanked him, even though I had looked over the floor plans of the entire school that my dad had sent me on my phone. The old gym was the last remaining part of the old junior high school building, which had been the only part of it that had been renovated before the money from the state government was cut off. As such, it was unheated and without power since the rest of the school it had been connected to was gone. But it was also old enough that it was built back when natural lighting and windows that opened were still something they kept in mind when building stuff. Another girl from my homeroom was sitting in blue jeans and a blouse on a set of bleachers out of the sun, playing on her phone. Ryan called out to her. "Do you want to basketball, Lord?" She looked up from her phone to give him a look of disdain before returning to her phone. Austin walked over to pick up a basketball and began bouncing it while glaring at me. "You and me, one-on-one, winner plays re." That actually sounded fun. Ryan does a toss-up? The larger boy reluctantly handed over the ball to the smaller one. Ryan held the ball while me and angry boy faced off, and then he tossed it nearly to the ceiling. Both of us jumped high as I let my chi flow into my legs to increase my leg strength, and coiled it around my lower body around my center of gravity to lighten myself. To my surprise, Austin leaped pretty high himself, but I went higher and got there faster. He slapped the side of my foot to try to send me off balance as I dropped. I spun with it to let the force move me to the side to land well clear of him to make a run up to the net, which had been placed a good 10 feet higher than normal, only 5 feet below the rafters. I jumped and dropped the ball down into the net and pushed off of the rim to spin and land facing the big boy as he pounded down the court looking ready to slam into me, only to skid to a stop as I stood in a stance my dad got out of an old movie, when my Uncle Dave called, very dramatic, but no worse than anything else, "You're going to drop the moment you start moving." Austin glared down at me from over a foot taller, and I glared right back up to him. Ryan slipped between us and began waving his arms back and forth in front of his friend. "No fighting, Austin." Dolores swore she would break the arm of anyone who made her look bad in front of the sheriff. The larger boy looked enraged, with both of his hands squeezed into fists, then he took a deep breath, let it out, and stomped over to the bleachers to drop down with his arms crossed. Ryan chased down the ball and began dribbling it while grinning at me. My turn, if you're still willing to play? I returned his grin and nodded. There wasn't a toss-up this time. I guess he wanted to at least start with the ball. He wasn't bad, he may have even played basketball a lot more than I ever had, but I was quicker, faster, and more accurate. I stole the ball every time, and after 3 baskets, he called out, "Switch." I tossed the ball to Austin, and he tried every dirty trick I had ever heard of, traveling, trying to shoulder or elbow me out of the way, jumping at me to try to body slam me while shooting for the basket. I should have been mad, but I was above it. If we had played it straight, or turned it into a real fight, it would have been boring. Instead, he surprised me with a few moves and even connected with me a few times well enough to knock me off balance, while Ryan kept calling him to switch off before the larger boy lost his temper. Ryan focused on making things challenging for me rather than scoring points. All in all, it was a fun way to kill most of an hour and a nice break from regular classes. Then I had to go take a shower in the girls' locker room with a bunch of strangers. It turns out an entire gym class of 14-year-old girls having to shower all together at the same time, for the first time, meant none of us were all that comfortable about it. That, and they have to be putting something in the water around here. I did recognize a few of the girls from the solstice picnic earlier that summer, which meant they came from werewolf families. But since they hadn't been shuffled off to the doghouse, Ryan's name for the old gym, with me, Lord, and the boys meant that they themselves weren't werewolves. So, late bloomers? Or not enough magic in them to sustain the curse? According to what Grandma Bree was calling the Cain scale, you needed a magic level of at least a 5, on a 10 low to 1 high scale for internal magic, to sustain the werewolf spell long enough for it to set in. But anyone above a 10, a baseline human, could learn some degree of internal magic, especially for something they had a talent for. And if these girls came from even one werewolf parent, they should be able to learn some things, not just physical stuff either. Internal magic can be used on the mind as well. One of the first things my mom had taught me was a technique for improving my ability to retain information, something that was going to help a lot with high school classes. Maybe Dad's dojo could teach a lot more than just werewolves. Oh, looks like we're locker neighbors. Nicole, who I had met on the bus that morning, had opened the combination lock on the gym locker next to me. She was pretty fit as well, although she had some padding over her muscles, which at her age might mean she had at least one more growth spurt before she topped out. Oh, yeah. So what did you guys get to do in the gym? Nicole gave me an odd look. Floor hockey, but how did you get sweaty enough to need a shower? I thought you had a doctor's note to get out of doing anything. Think, Sarah, think. Well, I can still play sports and stuff, I just have to pace myself to just one other person or work out by myself. If it's a group, I push myself trying to keep up with everyone and overdo it. She blinked and then nodded. I guess that makes sense. Do you think I can sneak off to the old gym too? I don't really like group sports either. I get distracted if there's too many people. I nodded my head. It might be better to get permission from the coach instead. Forgiveness might be easier than permission, but getting caught going behind someone's back can mean never getting either. Nicole frowned. Or it might be easier to get my mom to sign a note, might as well get some use out of having a doctor for a mom. I had managed to finish getting dressed by this time aside from the shoes I was pulling on. I had learned to pull water out of simple things like towels in my hair, but I hadn't thought about the fact that drying my hair by passing my hand along it might be suspicious until I came out of the shower. Luckily, there were nearly a dozen hair dryers plugged in and hung up on the wall opposite the mirrors above the sinks. Since I had gotten out of the shower and dried off quicker than most anyone else, I managed to get to one of the few left in time to dry my hair out with a combination of magic and hot air. Then I handed it off to Nicole as she stood there looking a little lost. She shook her head as she took it from my hand. Tomorrow, I'm getting a shower cap or something else to put over my hair, even if I have to get it shipped overnight. I nodded in agreement since I thought it was a good plan if you didn't get sweaty playing against a set of aggressive, Austin, or sneaky, Ryan, boys. All I had thought while playing against them was that getting a barrette that would stay on my head would be nice, or possibly a sweatband. I waved goodbye to Nicole as I headed out, only to find a bunch of boys from the gym. all lurking in the hallway outside the gym that led back to the main building of the school, some of them with their hair not only still wet but appearing to be completely uncombed. Which included Austin, who was now lumbering my way. Well, lumbering was a little unfair, but he was so big and heavy that he seemed off balance. Maybe he had just put on that height and weight over the summer and was still adjusting. He stood in front of me wordlessly for a moment. Good game, was I pushing things too much? I stare up at him for a moment. Yes, but I liked the way you made it more of a challenge. He smiled a little, it looked more like a grimace. Those games you talked about, is one of them basketball? I considered that, I think so? Sorry, but I'm not all that sure, I've only been to one once, because my dad lost a bet and had to show up. And I was there to watch the fights, so I didn't see much of anything else. All I saw was the people playing soccer outside. I can ask my parents tonight though. He nodded to me and then turned around to reacquire the same spot he had been leaning against before, a set of smaller boys shuffling out of his way from where a late arrival from the boys' locker room had gotten them spread out. Well, at least I'm not the only one with bad social skills. His friend Ryan and Nicole had only gotten out into the waiting hall when the bell rang and everyone was off to the hallways of the main building filled with people trying to get to their lockers or their next class, while others people were stopping right in the middle of the hallways to talk to someone while everyone else was forced to squeeze past them. At least they weren't blocking the lockers. My mom had planned to make me a nutritious lunch to take to school, but I managed to convince her that showing up with a lunch on the first day would destroy the image I was trying to build, and would deny one more thing I had missed out on by being homeschooled. Complaining about how horrid school lunches were a tradition. Besides, the lunches were free to all students, which I'm sure was the real reason I was lunch bag free. Growing up helping her parents shop for their Korean restaurant had made my mom a bargain shopper with a tight fist even though my family had money even before we found out about Grandpa Lathe and his lottery winning. In any case, having dumped my books for the morning at my locker, I made it in line with only a few dozen people in front of me. One of the girls who hung out with Dell every time I had seen her, Angie, was in line in front of me and waved a few people past her until I caught up with her. Our kind. She pointed at herself, then behind me at Ryan, who was grabbing a tray. We get extra large portions, usually without asking. Is that something you need too? I shook my head. No, not unless I've been pushing myself. Thanks for asking. She nodded at me. Okay, I can tell Dell I made an effort to be nice to you. She leaned her head back to look down at me with a smirk. Now I can snub you for the rest of the day, maybe even for the week. Then she moved down the line to get a double helping of some meat patties with gravy while I stood there a little confused. What? Ryan passed me up in the line and I had to step up close behind him before anyone else got in front of me. The thin teen seemed pleased with his double serving of meat patties with mashed potatoes. Yes, mystery meat reconstituted potato flakes, just like Mom used to make. The lunch lady who had scooped out the food from the large tray narrowed her eyes at him. Very funny, Ryan. Keep it up and I'll pack some up for your dinner tonight. I held up my plate and noticed the woman looked a lot like Ryan. She scooped the potatoes out along with a ladle of gravy from the meat tray after setting one of the patties on my plate while telling me it's mostly beef, along with some pork and chicken. Not the best cut of beef, but it's pretty good for cafeteria food. The vegetables are fresh from the farmer's market at least until the end of the fall. I thanked her as a girl who looked like she should still be attending school gave me a good-sized scoop of mixed vegetables that looked steamed. I noticed that the ladle was big enough to easily have given me twice the amount of vegetables. The werewolves probably never wanted that much and she assumed the same for me. By the time I got to the end of the line, I had a roll, a paper-covered square of butter, and finally a choice of a paper carton of milk or a plastic bottle of water. I grabbed the milk. Dairy products had given me some trouble when I was younger, but my Uncle Dave taught me his technique to handle dairy. He had taken the drink milk for big strong bones thing as a kid seriously enough to start a whole line of digestive techniques, which had helped to make him the Ichiban family training master. It must have worked. At 5'10", he's one of the tallest men on my mom's side of the family. I myself was still hoping for at least 2 more inches by the time I was 18, but 5'6" would be enough for me. Being big just made you more of a target. Heading out into a big room filled with tables, I wasn't all that sure where to go. Other than Ryan, I had beaten everyone here that I knew who might be in this one of the 3 lunch periods. So I picked a table in the corner of the room with a corner brick support pillar to my back and a good view of the 3 entrances to the lunchroom, 2 hallways, and the exit from the serving room. Nicole came out of the lunch line and looked around with the same lost look I must have had. I gave her a wave and she smiled in relief as she headed my way. Thanks, I haven't met anyone other than the people on the bus this morning. But don't worry, you won't be stuck with me all semester if you're just being nice. I thought that over. Even if there are some people I already know, I'm not going to want to sit with the same people every day. We both can mix it up a little. Then I settled into my lunch, channeling chi in my stomach to ensure that everything got fully digested to get the maximum nutrition from each bite. Thanks, Uncle Dave. Just as the 2 of us were finishing our meals, Kevin, Nicole's younger brother, and the werewolf from the bus that morning, Skip plopped down in the remaining 2 chairs. I was a little surprised since they were both young enough to have walked into the elementary school with my younger sister and brother. Nicole explained. The kids that are old enough to carry their own trays eat over here. Kevin shook his head, I wish we didn't. Skip sat us down with a bunch of teenage werewolves, even the skinny kid finished before me and was eyeballing my food. Skip shrugged. You were teasing them. Nicole's brother clenched his hands in the air. The food was actually good, they had Hawaiian rolls. I was savoring it, and then I look up to see 5 of you guys all staring at me. All of you were nearly drooling. The other boy shrugged. The rolls were good, and you had only eaten the top. His eyes went distant. And the bottom had gravy soaked it while still being crisp around the edges, and the butter still melted on top. I hastily stuffed what would have been 2 bites of my roll into my mouth. Nicole looked at his sister and then me, so are you 2 friends yet? It's going to make it a lot easier to spy on your family for the secret order of monster watchers if you are. I choked on my roll as the red-headed boy rolled his eyes. The bell rang as I tried to wash down the last of the roll with what was left of my milk. The other 3 people at my table stood up to make their way to their next class, with Nicole holding back for a moment. I wasn't trying to be sneaky or anything. Your dad had invited us to dinner tonight and you'll get the full details tonight. See you then. She gave me a hesitant smile and an awkward wave as she hurried out. So. This was another thing my parents hadn't told me about. Some sort of organized group monitoring people like me, and people like the werewolves. And Mom and Dad didn't even warn me. Instead, they just planned to spring it on me without any chance to discuss it first. I didn't have time to make an angry phone call or text before I had to get all the way across the school, up 1 floor to my locker, then halfway back to the lunchroom, and down a floor to get to my US history class. Another class, if the gym in a different building counted, that I shared with Nicole, who cringed a little as I walked into class and shot her a sharp look and sat 2 rows away from her and a couple of chairs back. As a first-day thing, the teacher covered the curriculum, the every other week tests, and what we could do for extra credit. A diorama to go with our end-of-term paper was mandatory. I had thought that was just something they did in TV shows. I held back a minute to let Nicole get out of the classroom well before me, as I had my books for life science with me already. I wasn't in a hurry. My last class of the day was in a classroom full of tables with gas taps and tiny sinks, along with seats for 2 at each workstation. As I looked around to figure out where to sit, knowing I would be stuck for the semester with whoever sat next to me as a lab partner, I felt someone large step into the room behind me. Turning around, I saw Austin looking down at me. I get good grades, not the best, just good. Then he half-stepped around me to sit at a table in the back. Okay, I walked up to his table and made a waving gesture at him. He looked up and sighed. I don't like talking, so people think I'm stupid. But I can usually get at least a B. My mom's a teacher and made me learn how to. He thumbed his hand on the table. To learn. Then he shrugged. I looked at him and then around at the rapidly filling room. Can we at least sit up close to the board? He seemed surprised. Yeah, but I don't want to block anyone from seeing the board. I waved at him to follow me to a table near the window, then froze in place seeing a goose looking back at me from an enclosed courtyard in the middle of the school. I had seen it on the maps for the school, but I hadn't seen anything about the various birds filling up the large space. Is that a peacock? The large boy nodded. Charlie. The peahen is Jenny. I looked at the birds again for a second, then waved Austin to the outer seat. You're there so you aren't right between anyone and the blackboard? When I had last gone to school, all the green-colored chalkboards had been replaced with white boards. Even the other classrooms in this school at least had the green-colored ones as well. This class had a black one with white chalk dust in the corners. It also had a very old man who wrote his name on the board and introduced himself. Today we will be covering Introduction to Biology, which is what I am calling your life science class. My name is Mr. Monterey, and I've worked at this school longer than anyone else, so I get to do things my way in my class. I taught most of the other staff here, and I can take them in a fight. The almost entirely bald little man flexed his wiry left arm. Nothing but muscle and bone left on the arm, nothing to slow me down. He proceeded to cover the syllabus, noting the things he planned to cover that would not be on the test since he wasn't supposed to be covering them, but was going to do so anyways. All of which added up to twice as much work to do as any of my other classes. You're in high school now, boys and girls. This isn't a place for wimps. I wrote at the corner of the page I had opened in my notebook. Is this guy crazy? Austin checked to make sure Monterey was ranting in the far corner from us, then noted on his notebook. Bark at the moon, insane. Which I took to mean the old guy was a werewolf as well. And I had more homework, as I had a chapter to read that night with a quiz tomorrow. So he was evil as well. As I slipped out of the large boy's way, he grunted and spoke up when I turned to look. Some people swing by the old gym after school until the second round of buses go out. He began heading out behind the first people out the door, without a further word. Thanks for the invitation, Austin, but I got to call my parents first. I may need to get home to chew them out. He grunted again in return. I made my way back to my locker, repacked my book bag with what I needed that night, and made my way outside. My mom answered after the third ring. Let me guess, you're upset about our dinner guests? Yeah, Mom. First, you tell me that werewolves and vampires aren't real, now there's a society of monster hunters. Are we on their list? She sighed. I've mostly worked with humans, and I ignored anything that didn't make sense to me. Your father worked with a more varied clientele working for his grandmother, Endora. And it's more like an alliance. Some of them used to have problems with the people in this town, and some of them are people like us. I could hear a door close behind her as she stepped outside. But mainly they just keep an eye on everyone who is supernatural with an agreement that we have a window to take care of the worst types of people, the ones who are too much of a danger to others, human or otherwise. Either we take care of them or the associates step in and hunt them down like their ancestors did. I turned to wave at Nate as he came bounding down the steps behind me, pointing at my phone. And these people coming to dinner. My mom sighed. Baseline humans, at least they won't eat so much. I pulled the phone away from my head long enough to give it a shape look. No, Mom, are they here for someone? Are we in danger? Is Grandpa? She was quick to reply this time. No, no. Henry and his wife are retired from that sort of thing. They got assigned here as an early retirement, keeping an eye on the locals. Keeping track of who is coming and going, they even provide new papers for anyone who has aged out of their identities. Sheriff Adora even knows about them. She's coming to dinner too, by the way. I looked up at Neil, who had wandered in close enough that he must have heard part of that. When I looked at him, he nodded in return. I'm not sure what that nod meant, so I moved on to my question. They have a sports meet after school until 4:30, and the buses go out again to get people home. Is it all right if I stay? My mom gave me a cheery. Sure, make some friends. Just call if you're running late or getting a ride. And get home right afterwards, even if you have to run. Bye. I got out a bye of my own before she hung up, and then I looked at Neil. Do you know anything about people watching you and yours? My friend, who was a boy, looked concerned. I was told if we caused trouble outside of town, biting people, going wolf in front of them, we might not come back. I always thought they meant the vampires would come after us. I looked up into his deep brown eyes, which were looking back at me, still looking concerned. Ah, yeah. Guess I'll find out more tonight, and fill you in. He nodded back at me. So, you got a gym full of werewolves waiting for you to show up and talk about the other Olympics and your dad's dojo. And they are going to come looking for you if you don't head over there soon. Oh yeah, that. I didn't think I was going to get to play much today. Instead, I had to face down a pack of magically enhanced teenagers who had grown up being frustrated about not getting to play sports. I'm sure it will be delightful. Walking over to the gym, I dialed my dad's number. To my surprise, my Uncle Dave answered. In Japanese, which would cut Neil out of the conversation. Your father is busy tossing your grandfather around, number one student. My eyes went wide. What? Why? He can heal, but getting hurt still hurts. There was a long pause. Yes, that would be true. No, I mean, even if he can heal from an injury, getting injured still hurts, and he's really old. Even as a werewolf it's easier for him to get hurt. I could hear him as my uncle called out to someone else in English. Sarah is worried about you and your weak, decrepit bones, Mr. Larch. My grandfather called back. Tell her I'm winning, her dad's too afraid to fight like a real man. Uncle Dave came back on the line and switched back to Japanese. They are just practicing taking falls and getting back to their feet. What do you need? I have a gym full of werewolves who want to hear about the games and Dad's dojo. There was another pause. Tell them about the games. There is a tournament coming up that you are old enough to take part in while they can attend in the audience as part of your father's dojo. I will be there in an hour with your father to tell them what they can expect. Then he hung up on me without another word. Neil was giving me another concerned look. Who was that? He sounded angry. I dropped my phone back into my bag. That was my Uncle Dave, he's always angry. Then I smiled at him. I'll introduce you to him in an hour, it will be fun. Neil looked a little unsure about that. I had a bit of a crowd waiting for me when I got to the old gym. It looked like most of the 23, I counted that morning, students from homeroom that morning, which had included all the werewolf students in the high school. The crowd also included several younger people that looked like they must have already graduated, as well as a few older people. Some of which were teachers from the school, as well as bus drivers and various people who had wandered in from off campus. Including Dare, the sheriff's grandson, who lived next door to my grandfather. When some people came to my grandfather's home looking to either kidnap or bleed him out, vampires loved werewolf blood, Dare and Melinda's mom Debbie had come running. On all fours. Dare even took a bullet defending me and my family. If he wants to hang out around a high school, I wasn't going to say anything about it. Oh, and did I mention they were all looking at me? Dell sat up from between her two friends who had been leaning in whispering to each other and waved at me. Get on with it, Sarah. We're all waiting. I took a deep breath and walked out into the middle of the gym. I could feel Neil walking out behind me but stopping short several feet behind me. Hi. I waved at everyone. My training does not include public speaking. But I have to say this first, my uncle, Dave Ichiban, will be coming here along with my father, John Kane, to discuss my father's dojo. If you have any questions about it, wait to ask them because the dojo is news to me as well. Some of the people watching me looked disappointed, mostly the boys, others seemed intent on what I was going to say next. What they call the other Olympics isn't that big, it's mainly North and Central America, and it was pretty informal at first. People from most of the families that have magic hadn't been allowed to play normal sports with what my family has taken to recently calling baseline humans. So when the families and other organizations got together to watch martial arts tournaments, some people got excited and wanted to do some unofficial fighting, while others just wanted to test themselves against each other in other ways. At first, it was just people taking advantage of the basketball and volleyball courts in the same places where the fighting bouts were being held. Later, there were even teams set up to meet in a league for baseball, and some martial arts bouts happened on the ball game's sidelines. I held up one finger. But no football, or any other contact sports. Not everyone knows how to do self-healing, or can cheat by being born with it. Dell smirked at me. It's not cheating, it's a legacy. I rolled my eyes and made a show of sighing. Anyways, there's a meet coming up soon, if anyone wants to check it out. My uncle says we can get in as students of my dad's dojo, but I think that's just a scam to get people to sign up. Ryan raised his hand. I awkwardly wave a hand at him. We're not in school, Ryan, I think you can just ask. He stood up and shook his head. It's better to do things this way so we don't try to yell over each other. He took a glance around, then asked. Are there other werewolves at these meets, or in the fighting tournaments? I threw my hands up. I honestly don't know. My mom said there were no werewolves, vampires, or anything like that. Just humans with magic. Apparently, she's met all sorts of supernatural races, and just thought they were humans who had trained in different ways. She just thought my dad was messing with her when he said anyone was something else. Looking around the room, I shrugged. That's what I thought until my grandpa turned his hand into a long-fingered paw covered in fur with 3-inch-long claws. The crowd went still until Dare called out. Oh, bullshit. I looked at him and saw a look of amused disbelief on his face. Granny can't even do that, I've never even heard of anyone doing something like that. Most of the rest of the people packed into the room looked like they didn't believe me either, which was getting me pretty upset. Like I was going to lie. Then Neil spoke up behind me. Did Sheriff Karras ever TR? Mr. Lathe became one of us without anyone telling him what we could or couldn't do. I turned half around to give him a quick grin and resisted the urge to tell him he was a good boy. From the stands, I heard one of Dell's friends say, "Holy." Dell Jones, granddaughter of Adora Karras, the only werewolf around other than Grandpa capable of taking on the half-human half-wolf shape my grandpa called the war form, was holding up one of her hands palm out with a look of disbelief at the full set of short but sharp claws on her fingertip. Painted red from the tips to about halfway down. I smiled. Good for her. Her successes did not diminish me, something my grandmother had told me over and over during the summer of watching my little sister turning into a true witch while I struggled to make a tiny light. Congratulations, Delaware. You not only did it, you did it without making your hand and arm look all gross and hairy. She looked up at me and her look of wonder turned into a grimace and then embarrassment as she realized everyone in the room was looking at her. Well, everyone except Austin, who was going red in the face glaring down at his clenched fist in frustration at its stubborn refusal to change. And Dare, who was nearly sprinting as he ran along the bleacher to grab his younger sister's hand, not to examine her claws, but to lift her up in the air in a hug with her clawed hand up in the air above them both and spinning her around and around, putting both of them in danger of tumbling down the bleachers to the ground. My Uncle Dave spoke up from next to me, sending me spinning off to the side in a defensive stance. Those will be very interesting to incorporate into a martial art, I envy your father. Then he glanced over at a shocked-looking Neil. You walk like a warrior. I approve of you dating my student, but don't get her pregnant until she is done with school. Neil's eyes went wide. Well, what? I didn't protest, I just tried to drive the tip of my shoe into the back of my uncle's head, starting from his face. It was on. He blocked the kick and I pushed off of his raised arm and spun in the air, letting my book bag swing up so as I spun around I could snap it out towards his groin. He turned to take it on the hip, and I think I surprised him for once when the bag continued to spin because I had held onto the strap. A spin that let me try to put a back kick into his kidneys, which failed as he jumped over my leg with a backflip, to land on his feet. Rather than use a technique to recover, he spun his leg out to try to trip them, then came up as I leaped over his foot. As he came up, he lunged forward with a flat palm toward my belly, with a shout. only to turn the trusting palm into a twisting stand as he grabbed Neil, who had jumped forward with a shout of "Hey!" before Uncle Dave spun him around and sent him flying 20 feet away to land but first on one of the bleacher seats with a grunt and a shocked look. My uncle glanced from him to the punch I tried to get in as he finished his spin. As he tried to twist my fist, he stopped it with his open hand. He asked, "That won't hurt him, right?" I shook my head as I slipped my fist free. "Not for long." He grinned, or what passes for grinning for him, a sort of thinning of his lips. "Endurance, that would be a good thing in a boyfriend." Then he winked at me. "Ugh. Stop it. Stop being gross." He slapped aside my fist as I tried to pull back and got a knee into my guts that lifted me up 5 feet and sent me flying back another 10. Then he jumped forward to try to drive a fist into me while I was in the air. I used it to twist my momentum to the side and land 10 feet from him. As he sat down, he took his instructor stance and nodded his head behind me. Nearly everyone in the gym was on their feet and looking ready for a fight. I smiled. It was nice to see so many people ready to back up someone who was almost a complete stranger to them. "It's okay, he's just playing. He's not even using any techniques. Are you okay, Neil?" Neil nodded and then sat back down, shifting his shoulder around while pressing one hand up against his back. Uncle Dave turned with his hand behind his back and looked around the room. "I am David Ichiban, the training master of House Ichiban for the last 50 years. Sarah is my grandniece and my #1 student. I have hopes that she will one day replace me once she has passed her 50th birthday and is mature enough to have mastered all of House Ichiban's techniques." He stepped up next to me as I stared at him in shock. He turned his head to look down at me for a moment with an almost gentle smile before he turned his head back to the werewolves with a stern look. "Techniques are not for you. They require the ability to use your chi, your magic, freely. Your condition uses all of your magic, leaving nothing to use outside of the curse." That started some comments, so my uncle brought his hand around in front of him, each hand as hard as iron as he clapped them together with the sound of 2 stone slabs crashing together. "But, you are strong, fast, and tough. As well as some of you having other tricks." He gave Dell an almost approving look. "You can still learn to fight on a level that will resemble something out of the most cheesy martial arts action movies Hong Kong or Hollywood can produce." He gave them an evil grin. "Your greatest strength is that your instructors can train you quickly and fully since they don't have to hold back due to your ability to heal quickly from any injury." My uncle looked at me again. "Can they heal from dismemberment?" I sighed. "They can, some of them, but even then they have to wait until the full moon to heal on that level." He frowned. Somewhat limiting. Still, your father can at least get serious just before the full moon. I shall get him a lunar calendar as a dojo warming gift." Some of the werewolves now looked a bit concerned. I waved at them. "It's okay, everybody. This is just his sense of humor." They looked at me, then at my uncle's tight-lipped smile. I don't think they entirely believed me. Neil raised his hand. Are you going to be teaching at the dojo?" Uncle Dave shook his head sadly. "No, but I may bring some of my students over a few times a year to train against someone new." But, he seemed to brighten up. "They will get to use their techniques. It will give all of you who become John's students a chance to learn how to deal with them." I turned toward my uncle. "Where is he anyways? You said he was coming as well." My uncle turned to me and brought his hand out from behind his back, showing he was ready to spar again. He hates seeing his little girl getting beaten up. "Remember, no techniques. Your father wants them to see how people as strong and fast as them with training can fight." We got serious and mostly stopped holding back, or at least I did. I don't think I could beat Uncle Dave if he went full out, but I think I could at least put up a fight. I had several bruises and was worn out by the time Uncle Dave was done with me. My new workout clothes were ripped, I had lost some of the treads on my new sneakers from pushing off from the walls, and I was soaked with sweat. All this over the course of 10 minutes. It was great, aside from my uncle berating me the entire time for being out of practice and swearing to discipline my mom for letting me slack. "You leave my mom alone, bully." Meanwhile, we had a real conversation by screaming at each other in Japanese. I thanked him for doing this since it let me show off in front of the werewolves what I could do, and then chewed him out in real anger for teasing me about Neil. In response to which, he teased me some more, and I punched a hole in the floor. Which is when we decided to stop. As I was catching my breath, he told me, "Finish saying goodbye to your friends. Then I'll drive you home. You need to get cleaned up before you sit down with the enemy." What now? I tried to answer some questions, got teased by Dell about busting up the floor, and then got walked toward the door by my neighbor Dare under the excuse that my uncle was waiting on me. He stopped outside the door to the gym. "One more question?" I nodded. He looked around for anyone listening in, before finally looking back at me and asking in a low whisper, "Is your uncle single?" I looked away. I've never heard of him having anyone, but talking about this is really making me really uncomfortable. Dare looked surprised, then embarrassed as he took a step back. "Sorry, Sarah. I didn't, you know." He waved his hands around in front of him awkwardly. "Sorry." I nodded while looking down. "It's okay, I just don't know how to have this conversation, and I got to go." "Okay?" He nodded and took another step back. "Yeah, I think we're good. We can try talking about anything else next time. Maybe watches?" I gave him a confused look, but nodded. Odd choice, but a safe one. Uncle Dave was pretty quiet on the drive home, and his bags, a faded green old duffel bag, and a beat-up leather courier's bag were still in the back seat of his rental. A blue four-door sedan. I looked over at him from the passenger seat. "So you haven't been to the house yet?" He nodded just enough for me to see it as he kept his eyes on the road, aside from a regular glance to the side with his eyes keeping an eye out for anything coming at the car from the sides. "Your mother sent pictures." "Many, many pictures. Does she honestly think I need to know what the house looks like from a dozen different angles to recognize it?" "I have the address." I stared at him. "You've never had a girlfriend, have you?" He gave me an irritated side glance. "I was married to a woman from another family. My children chose her when they came of age. Clarice was not a sentimental woman." I sat there for a moment. "I never knew that." He shrugged. "It happened before you were born. I don't feel any need to discuss it further." We slowed down to the front gate of the property my house stood on. A small mostly open-sided brick building with two benches inside of it stood to one side of a short metal automated gate. The shed-like building was there for me and my younger sister and brother to shelter from the rain and snow while waiting for the school bus. It even had a heating unit built into the roof. My uncle pressed a button on the intercom. "I am here." My dad's voice came from it, very informative. "Dave. You got my eldest with you?" Uncle Dave pressed the button again and grunted in the affirmative. He and my dad had spent a good hour going over male grunting and facial expressions with me once. I thought they had just been joking, but I've seen and heard at least some of it from other men on screen and in real life, often enough to not dismiss it entirely. I grabbed Uncle Dave's bag and headed inside to run it up to the guest room upstairs. Once inside the front door, I could smell the steamed rice and meat buns. It smelled like Mom was going tradition tonight. After dropping off his stuff, I headed up another flight of stairs and I was at the front of my open bedroom door with Saku sitting in it staring in. She turned her head to give me a welcoming bark, but instead of turning around to run into my legs and try to trip me down the stairs, she just turned her head to stare back into my room. I walked up to my door cautiously. Was my dad waiting inside to cato me? Or was this something serious? Inside my room, leaning up against the foot of my bed, was a naginata, with a blade that was pure black and fitted to the green-stained shaft with silvery fitting. A thin band of the same metal secured a pool ball-size orb on the other end of the weapon. It had a feeling of weight to it and felt like it was making a humming sound even though I couldn't hear anything. I yelled down the steps. Dad, is there supposed to be a scary-looking Naginata in my room? I heard him shout, "What?" And then I could hear him, Mom, and Uncle Dave whisper at each other before Uncle Dave shouted back at me. "It wasn't supposed to come to you until me and your grandfather presented it to you after the enemy left. Happy birthday." Wide-eyed, I slowly walked across the room and took up the weapon with a grin so wide it hurt. "Mine." Saku barked. My dad complained to Uncle Dave as they thundered up the stairs. Ami spoke up from her now open bedroom door. I tried to get a closer look at it, it kind of growled at me, but without any sound. Then Saku dragged me out by my skirt. I turned to look and saw most of my immediate family standing outside of my room, aside from my mom, who wouldn't chance anything burning just to check out an actual magical weapon showing up on its own in her kid's room. Uncle Dave nodded in satisfaction. "I made it, your Aunt Rosario enchanted it to find you when it was needed, and your grandfather paid for the materials I did not already have. He also gave me what was left of a worn-out old knife that belonged to his father, and his grandfather before him. But the metal was still true, and I used it along with 3 of the ingots my father had brought with him from Japan. The steel from the knife had already served your family for 5 generations since it had served your ancestor in the American Civil War by its make. Now it will serve you." He gave me a formal bow, which I returned. "There is much I still need to teach you, but you are no longer only a student, but a warrior of House Ichiban." My dad's eyes looked suspiciously wet. "Congratulations, Sarah. Now go take a shower." As headed back downstairs, he yelled out. "Your grandpa made a rack for it, he'll bring it by when he comes over later." I grinned at my uncle and nearly began hopping up and down. "I can try it out for a while before dinner, right?" "I got to try it out, please?" He shrugged. "Up to you, managing your time is something a warrior should be able to do, not like a little girl." I nodded, opened my bedroom window, and dove out, Naginata in hand. When I landed, the ball on the bottom went 6 inches into the ground even though I had only meant to set it down. I pulled it out and looked at the hole, and then the Naginata. "I'll figure it out later." I managed to do forms with it while running through the woods with Saku chasing along behind me for a good 10 minutes before I got a text from my mom, "Shower now." Heading back in the front door, my little brother Aaron's eyes locked onto the Naginata and he did his best to follow me all the way up to my room. I set the weapon on my bed and watched it sink into the mattress a good inch or so. "Right, check that later." Bathrobe in hand, I caught Aaron at the top of stairs as I headed to the bathroom. "Aaron, this is the girls' floor. Back to the boys' floor with you. You know the rules." He started to sniffle and pointed into my room. "Want to see?" I slapped my hand against my leg. "Saku." My pup sprung out of her bed and trotted up to me. I pulled my bedroom door shut behind her and pointed at the ground. "Good girl, guard." Then I gave my now teary-eyed little brother a sharp look. "You do not get to play around with weapons without one of us with you. I will show it to you later, but for now, you have to stay out. Promise me, Aaron." He nodded slowly and whispered, "Sorry." Then sat down next to Saku and slowly began to pet her from the back of her neck to halfway down her back, before giggling as my pup turned and licked his face. Then I rushed through washing for dinner while I still had some time, which by the sound of my dad talking to someone on the intercom I didn't have much time left. After making my way downstairs, I found a couple in their late middle age along with Nicole and her younger brother. My dad nodded over at me. "Sarah, these are Jack and Gail Anderson, and their kids, Nicole and Kevin." I gave the older people a friendly nod, with a brief glare for their daughter. "Hi, I'm going to see if Mom needs help." Then I headed for the kitchen. Since the wards didn't do anything to them, at least nothing involving them bursting into flames, I felt that I could leave Dad alone with them. In the kitchen I found Ami emptying one of the rice cookers into a bowl while my mom was working a stir-fry in the big wok. She started telling me what she needed to be done in Korean without bothering to look up as I came in. "Sarah, start setting the table in the dining room for 6, then the kitchen table for 5. Get the bench from the piano for Aaron." For a second I almost began complaining about why Ami didn't do it, but then she had probably been helping my mom while I had been out playing. And my mom was making dinner for 11, she didn't need to deal with any whining. Not that whining was completely off the table, I was just old enough now to know you should save it for rare occasions. It's more effective that way. I got the placemats, plates, forks, knives, spoons, glasses, and napkins out, then some pitchers of water with ice on both tables, the clear glass one out in the dining room, and a nice plastic one for the kitchen table. Then my mom set me to cutting up fruit for dessert while she fried the rice up with soy sauce and sesame oil in the everyday wok. Finally, she set me to carrying out the dishes while she looked herself over in the kitchen washroom, managing to avoid giving me any chance of interrogating her about what the deal with the supernatural hunting organization thing. Then I was sitting down with Ami facing down Nicole and Kevin, with Aaron nearly spilling the chicken stir-fry on the table as he tried to serve himself as Saku hid under the piano bench eagerly waiting to feast on 5-year-old spillage. Normally we ate in the dining room since Mom insisted that dinner should be a proper sit-down meal, but even then I was used to scooping out the food for my brother. Somehow the problem of spilled food causing ants to invade a house meant it was my job. But as I tried to take the serving spoon from the little guy, he gave me a deeply upset look that made me throw up my hands in surrender. Okay, just try to not get all of it on the floor. I got my spring roll and scooped out some rice while looking up at our guests. Best grab what you can if you don't fill up. Now, my grandpa will come looking for more food after they eat everything at the main table. I could hear my grandpa make a humph sound at that from the other room. A fascinating conversation was going on in the next room in which my grandpa was getting filled in on everything involved with an organization that kept watch on all the supernatural types while also helping them themselves secret. A conversation which I would have loved to have been a part of, or at least spied on, but someone kept trying to talk to me. Nicole started off with, "So, you're dating Neil?" I jerked my head around to stare at her as she took a bite out of her spring roll. Wha-huh? What? No. We're just friends, I'm only 14. She finished chewing while nodding. Everyone talking about how you stole him from Dolores, and that the only reason you two aren't fighting for him is that your grandparents are dating. Glaring at her, I took a deep breath before explaining, they weren't dating either, she just asked him to come with her to a few dances because she thought she would look weak if she showed up alone and she didn't want to favor anyone else. Nicole blinked. So it's not just that she's strong, she's smart too? Her brother nudged her with his elbow. Nikki, stop poking at her. Mom wants us to make friends, he turned to my sister. I saw you talking to some of the other girls at recess and lunch, how's that going? Ami stared him down with a creepy grin. I am gathering my first coven. We will rule the high school when my time comes. You can be one of my top 10 lackeys, but you have to act now. He stared at her for a moment, can I be part of the coven instead? She shook her head. You have to be a girl to be a witch, great-grandmother's rules. I can't do magic with boys until she's gone or they're related to me. I turned to look at her. Is that just for you, or is that one of her rules I was warned about? The one she just expects people to know without telling them. Ami stopped chewing for a moment, then swallowed. I don't know, but I would obey it anyway. She's scary. I forget sometimes, but then she starts talking about stuff she's done, really bad things. My little sister looked down at the floor, we had another great aunt once. She let her fork fall halfway out of her hand before I could lean over and give her a one-armed hug. Sometimes I get jealous over all the things Ami will be able to do as she learns how to use her powers. Then I get a hint at what she has to deal with along the way. No thank you. Nicole took a breath. Can I ask about her? Endora Kane. I shook my head at her. She's powerful, and she's lived so long, she doesn't know how to deal with people anymore. If you're not family, try to avoid her, and if you can't, just do what she tells you without speaking so she doesn't single you out. The dark-skinned girl thought that over and nodded. Her brother changed the subject. So I've asked around if there's anything to do in this town, but all I've heard about is country stuff. Hunting, fishing, swimming, four-wheeling. You've been here longer, if there anything fun? Ami shook her head. We got to go on a few trips outside the area over the summer, but the rest of the time we were taking lessons. Even when we had any free time we had to train, which Sarah liked. The only thing I got to that was fun was learning how to play piano with my dad. I realized that even Kevin was keeping the conversation focused on me and my sister, learning about us. Like the spies they were. It was time to turn the tables a bit. So what do you two like to do for fun? That was a mistake. Once Kevin got going, I had to listen to nearly 20 minutes of him going on about skating, the moves he had pulled off, and the things he had seen others do that he couldn't do. Finally, I heard the conversation out in the dining room turn into collecting dishes. Sarah, come help, then we're all going to have a talk in the living room. Typical mom move, make me work for something I want. After cleaning up the tables, everyone gathered up in the living room with me and Ami on the smaller couch facing Mr. Anderson and my dad sitting on some chairs from the dining room. Everyone settled in on the other couch and the comfy chairs. Mr. Anderson leaned forward in his chair, with his hands clasped together. Okay, Sarah and Ami, this is the talk I have with people who need to be read in on the supernatural world and how I can help them. A lot of this doesn't apply to you, Sarah, since you can pass for a normal, if gifted human being. We mainly just have to keep moving up your official birth date. With Ami. He paused to sigh. Well, keeping herself secret is something I would expect her to learn from her grandmother, and by way of a bad example, her aunt. So this is how it goes. During the Revolutionary War, a spy organization called the Culper Ring was set up to spy on the British, and while they were watching for anything the British were up to, they noticed some other people acting in secret. He looked over at my grandfather and the sheriff who was sitting next on the couch, who at his look reached over to take my grandpa's hand. Vampires living by night, werewolves in the countryside, and other people they couldn't even put names to. Looking back at us, he leaned back in his seat. After the war, the ring was supposed to have been dissolved, but instead, Washington had us focus on what he feared was an even bigger threat to our new nation. Predator living alongside their prey. Fortunately, there were already other groups out there watching the same kind of people we were, and they had already reached an accord with the supernatural people. I leaned forward myself. I nodded. Because they were internal magicians with enhanced abilities. Mr. Anderson grinned. So an arrangement was made. Organizations like mine, instead of hunting down everyone who was supernatural, just watched, and only made a move on those who committed crimes. And over the last 100 years, all of those groups began to exchange information, sort of a supernatural Interpol. I started to get excited. So the Culper Ring is still around, are they hiring? My dad spoke up. No, they don't hire people like us. Mr. Anderson shook his head at my father. Actually, that was just you, John. My dad shot him a betrayed look. Say what now? Mr. Anderson shrugged. You grew up in Endora Kane's magically hidden stronghold and worked as her personal agent. There was no way we could have hired you. Your kid, on the other hand, she grew up in a suburb. And she's Brianna Kane's granddaughter, not Endora's. People like your mother and would be inclined to trust her granddaughter. She would make a great agent. I began to grin. I could be a spy. Do we get code names? The secret agent man held his hands up as if to slow me down. Hang on, well, yes we do. Either a code name or a number. Washington's was 711. But it's more often than not we're more of a bureaucracy than a spy agency. I gave him a look of disbelief. Before Washington declined a third term of office, there was a meeting between the leaders of some of the more organized supernatural people in the new country, and some representatives of what's been called the Council, the Association, or the Society. All made up of the groups that used to hunt people like your grandfather and your family. An agreement was reached, they behaved, and the Culper Ring made things easier for them to live in secret while still being American citizens. He held his hands out. And that's what I'm here for, an easy job for an agent who is getting too old for field work. I'm here to help out Werewolf Central with things like adding a few years to their birth certificates, while still letting them collect Social Security with no one wondering why there are so many people over 100 years old in the same town. Also creating new paperwork for people who want to move out of town, or who want to live as a human again after taking a few decades off to live as a wolf. And anything else they might need help with. I took a long, slow breath. And what does the government get in return? He gave my dad a look and got a nod in return. Werewolves can sniff out vampires. Their very existence is our deterrent to some of the wealthy and powerful people in the country. Then he leaned back. And a surprising number of them are veterans, as are the members of the Culper Ring. We take care of our own. The sheriff spoke up then. Every agent before you either did things by mail, over the phone, or then over the internet. Why do we rate an in-person agent now, Mr. Anderson? He gave my dad another half grin. Because Endora Kane's grandson moved here right after his mysterious unknown father bought a mansion here and everyone in town started Googling his name. Because our clairvoyance began bleeding from the eyes when the wickedest witch left her home for the first time this century and folded space to do it. He leaned forward in his chair. Because John Kane applied for insurance for a martial arts dojo, as if he was planning to train people to fight right in the heart of werewolf country. And because there are whispers that the Kane family has added a new witch to their line, who is also a daughter of the Ichiban family. He folded his hands together, with his fingers interlocked. So yeah, they picked an agent near retirement who was known to be friendly enough with John Kane to have a beer with him and attend his wedding. And they sent him in to keep an eye on things, and told him to bring his whole family as hostages for his good intentions. He looked Sheriff Fedora right in the eyes. Washington himself proclaimed that all the people of the United States, human or otherwise, were people of his country. And would be treated with the same dignity and rights. So I am here with my own wife and children to ensure that. Mr. Anderson threw his head back to stare down his nose. You're the sheriff around here, your job is to protect and serve all the people in your country. Is my family going to be safe here? Adora threw her head back as well. Same deal. As long as they behave. My grandfather leaned forward in between the two's line of sight. I was told there was supposed to be a desert too. Fruit salad wasn't the fanciest thing in the world, and the vanilla-flavored whipped cream Grandpa had brought was unnecessary. But it was still a nice treat after a discussion that had gotten a lot more heated than I had expected. I had gone outside to sit on the swinging bench outside to eat my dessert because I wanted to think, so of course Nicole had followed me out and sat down next to me, with about half the fruit in her bowl that I did. I want to be an anthropologist. I gave her a confused look. What? She sighed, and let up a little bit of an ep sound as Saku scrabbled out from under the swing and began begging. I want to learn about people like the werewolves around here and your family. The Culper Ring has watched all of you for centuries without bothering to learn anything about you. She held up her bowl for permission and nodded over at Saku, setting the nearly empty bowl down for my pup to lick clean when I nodded. I want there to be more understanding between the people who are supposed to be protecting the supernaturals, and hunting them down when they go bad. I think there'd be a better chance of understanding and positive interaction if the ring agent know more about the people their whole careers are built around. With her eyes cast down to watch my dog chase the bowl that moved away from her with each lick, Nicole smiled a little. So I'm sorry if it felt like I was spying on you, I just want to know who you were before you knew who I was. I'm hoping you can forgive me even if we never become friends. Part of me wanted to crush her, not physically, but with words. To hurt her so she never tried to pull anything on me again. But my father had taught me that making enemies just left someone out in the world who had reason to hate you, and my mom taught me to never let an enemy live. But since I didn't think she had done enough to be an enemy. Alright, you're forgiven. Once. My second day of school started off with a run with my Uncle Dave, who kept staring at my dog as she kept ahead of us. Your dog is just not right. I drifted off the running path to give Saku some scratches, and praised her for being a good girl while my uncle looked on. Then we began running again. She's just special. He grunted at me. A resigned but still disapproving one. After getting cleaned up and eating, me, Ami, and Aaron headed out to the bus with just my mom this time. She explained, "Your dad headed over to his school early. He wants to finish up getting it painted today, so it has time to dry when he opens it up on Friday." I made a point to sit next to Nicole to symbolize that I didn't hold anything against her, but we chose to ride in silence at first since I wasn't ready to talk, and she was respecting that. At first. Your grandfather. The old man was standing outside his front gate in what had to be a brand new black tuxedo, waving and tipping his top hat as we drove by. The bus driver called back. "Somebody get his picture." My little sister called back that she had got him. Nicole had half stood up as she turned to keep looking at Grandpa. As she sat back down, she gave me a wide-eyed look. "Is he going to do that every morning?" I shook my head. "Oh no. He'll skip a day every now and then to give me hope that he'd stopped, and then he might later on drop it for an entire week. Then he'll do something even more elaborate, or he'll start doing it across the street from the school, even if he has to buy the property." Turning my head to let her see the horror in my eyes, I told her that. "He'll keep it up for years. He won't stop, nothing and no one will convince him otherwise." She looked back again. "I wish I was that close to my grandparents. I only get to see them a few times a year." I slowly nodded. "Yeah, he's frustrating. But it's nice to have gotten to know him." My school day passed by with several people asking questions about the dad's dojo or the trip to the games in Chicago, but all I could do was tell people to check out the dojo when it opened on Friday. That, and admit I didn't even know where the place was. I had yet to see it myself. It took me and Ryan a good 10 minutes to convince Austin that I wasn't going to spar with him in the gym. But I did show the two of them some basic katas to practice along with some breath control. But really the best thing to practice is running. The more endurance you have, the longer you can practice and make the most of the time you have with an instructor. But then werewolves have a lot of endurance. By the end of the gym, they had talked me into showing them how to work in some good blocks against the strike I had shown them. And with them being boys, I just knew they would be hitting each other by the end of the day. And Ryan at least would probably end up with a bloody nose. At least as a werewolf, it would be healed up in minutes. After school, I made an announcement at the gym covering the same information I had given everyone else over the day and got to play an actual game of basketball. Girls versus boys. Dell's ideal. I think she is avoiding any situation where we would be on opposite sides. Not because she's worried about me beating her at something, but because she doesn't want teenage drama to turn us being up against each other somehow mean something. Which is disappointing, since Dell has more athletic ability than anyone else I've seen playing. Ryan is pretty good too. He's small, but he's more aware of his surroundings than just about anyone else. Aside from Neil, who seems to be holding back all the time. I was going to have to get him on a court with just him and me sometime and make him play me seriously. Not right now, since that could be seen as a date, but sometime. Since I had mentioned several times that I didn't even know where my dad had set up his dojo, I was surprised when Neil offered to walk me over to it after school. "You'll miss the bus, but I'll get my mom to drive you home if your dad already left for the day." It was about a 20-minute walk from the school to the old fire station Neil finally pointed out to me. The county station was close enough after it was built that we didn't need the old one anymore. They turned it into a community playhouse, but it was never a good fit. They just use the schools now. No one responded to me knocking, so I began to tap on the lock, a flow of my chi flowing into it with each tap. I already knew how to pick a lock, so I could picture how to use magic to replace the tools I didn't have on me. And I could now check for the presence of wards, at least ones that weren't hidden. I turned the knob and pushed open the door to the smell of fresh paint and the sounds of fans. Neil followed me in, blinking rapidly. "Did you just pick a lock with your finger?" Giving him a grin, I blow on my fingertip. "Learned it from my grandma. She tried me on knitting too, but I can't sit still long enough to learn." One of the walls had more recently been painted a dark red color. Rather ominously the same color as fresh blood. The rest had a new coat of plain old white. I had gotten ominous from the word of the day email my grandfather had signed him, me, and my mom up for. We tried to use the words each day at least once around each other. It's nice to do things as a family. The impression that something bad or unpleasant is about to happen by the way. Neil was staring at the red wall. Why is only the one wall red? I took a long look at the big open room. There are windows and things on the wall on the other sides of the room. I think my dad wants people to get thrown that way since it's safer. It's red so people know it's the danger wall, so they don't stand in front of it. He'll probably mount padding on it later. There I came up with a nice reason for it to be red. Which is why it was so frustrating when my dad came in and announced, "It's red so the blood doesn't show." Dad. Don't tell him that. My dad grinned while keeping eye contact with Neil, but then rolled his eyes at me. Kidding, I'm planning on putting up some foam mats on those walls before we start doing throws. I still plan on telling the student the same joke about the blood stains. But in all seriousness, training here is going to get rough. He walked over to us to get into conversational distance. If you ever have to use my training in a real fight, chances are it will be with someone who is not only capable of killing you but will be actively trying to do so, or worse. My father, who had spent a lot of his last 40 years doing things he had only hinted at to me about, glanced off to the side. My goal is to develop a martial art that my family who are werewolves can use to protect themselves against a world full of dangers that I can't allow myself to hope will never come for them. He looked at Neil again and reached out to pat him on the shoulder. And if some of my students can end those dangers if they come to them first, well, that's one less danger to come after my family. Leaning forward, he almost gently pushed Neil back hard enough that my friend had to shuffle his feet a bit to keep from falling over. With practiced steps to keep his legs from catching on each other, or to be vulnerable to a side kick to his knees. He'd been trained. My dad nodded to himself. Who taught you? Neil straightened up. My grandfather and my uncle. My father got a big grin on his face. Marine Corps Martial Arts. Old school before the line system where they turned it into cookie-cutter training that relied on the other guy not knowing how to fight. It's a great foundation if you want to come here to learn more. Me and my father would be having a talk about how he knew Neil's family members had been in the military. Not because he had investigated my friend but because he hadn't shared what he had learned. My friend backed up nervously. No offense, sir. But you seem to disapprove of me hanging out with your daughter, so I don't think I want to give you a free chance to beat up on me. But Uncle Rich and my grandpa would probably love to throw down with you. Dad seemed to brighten up. I would love to spar with your relatives, Neil, but don't worry about training with me. I would be more likely to take it too easy on you so Sarah doesn't get mad at me rather than single you out for abuse. He looked at me and shook his head sadly. She tends to be protective of the people she likes. Neil blushed. I glared. Is that paint dry enough to take a few hits, old man? My dad gave me an exaggerated look of surprise. I thought your grandfather was old man? I clenched my teeth. He's the old man now. You're over 50, that's old. My father nodded grimly. Yeah, I'm old enough to be a grandfather. Then he turned to Neil and gave him a slow, exaggerated wink. I threw my book bag at his face and shouted, "Get him," at Neil. Sparring with Uncle Dave was always serious, with Dad it was more playing so my guy friend would be welcome to jump in. And it gave Dad a chance to see his moves as well. Which as far as I could tell, was pretty much a grab bag of mainly Japanese karate, jiu-jitsu, and judo, as well as regular boxing. Dad was grinning like a maniac as he pulled the top set of mats from under me and Neil's feet. I jumped clear while my friend half fell, half rolled onto the floor, and then back up to his feet. My father cheered him on. Good recovery, now stop holding back. I'm not a baseline human, I can take a harder hit. Less control, more wild swing, put some power into it. Not you, Sarah. I had assumed the paint can lid would be more secure when I kicked the can at his legs, but his attempt to stop it with his foot and the resulting near explosion of red paint coating the floor around him, and under his foot as he set it down to get his balance, did something I had been trying to do for as long as I remember. I had put my dad down on his butt. Arms in the air, I hooted as I did a victory lap around my sighing father, ending with a hug for the bemused teenage boy who still had the wherewithal to hug me back tightly enough to lift and spin me around with enough force for me to kick my legs back. I picked up wherewithal last Sunday. The money or other means needed for a particular purpose. As he set me down, I realized I was a little out of breath, from the fight of course. Short as it was. My dad stood up and began sliding his hands down his legs to push the paint off. It didn't count. You had help. Did my mom teach you anything to clean off the paint? I shook my finger at him. Not yet. And you never said I couldn't have help. If I can knock you down before I'm 16, you'll buy any car I want after I want for the first birthday I'm old enough to drive. No takebacks, and it's not like I had Uncle Dave or Mom helping me. Turning to Neil, I gave him a smile. No offense, you got some good moves, but they're professionals. Looking back at my dad, I began to point around the sides of the room with doors to other parts of the building. Are there towels or something in here I can get for you? And I was thinking of a convertible, emerald green, and only a 2-seater so you can't stick me with driving Ami and a bunch of her friends everywhere. He also showered off the paint in the locker room while I tried to rinse out as much paint as I could. Fortunately, they were some older clothes he had changed into to paint in, so he had some other stuff to change into. Neil got invited over for dinner when I called to let my mom know me and dad would be running late, which resulted in my dad teasing me that, you can have your little friend over for dinner, but he can't stay over for the night. I rolled my eyes at him while Neil finished up calling his parents. Yeah, Dad, I read that on your face. Oh wait, that's a spot of paint you missed. We ended up watching an old movie with Marines that Dad said had a good example of old school Marine Corps martial arts in it, and then he got Mom to drive Neil home since I figure Neil has had enough of me for the day. Neil nodded at that as he got into the car with my mom. Poor fool, he didn't realize that was just my dad tagging my mother in for her turn. At least she fed him first, and considering how much he praised her food, she'll probably take it easy on him. My first official tournament, representing the underage category for the Ichiban family in a red GI with a white belt, was in 2 weeks. Normally a white belt is that of a beginner in martial arts. But supposedly the founder of my branch of the family considered himself an unnatural creature, the first and only magic working on Myoto in the Ichiban family, but as capable of thriving as the oddly white Aodasho snake of the Yamaguchi prefecture. So we used a white belt for the middle ranks. But I think it was really just to mess with people. The homecoming dance, which Neil had just asked me to, was in 3 weeks. He just slunk into homeroom that morning, half asleep, sat at the desk next to me, then turned his head to me as he leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "Do you want to go to homecoming with me?" At first, I could not understand the words coming out of his mouth. The idea of going to a dance was so weird to me that I didn't put the words home and coming together as an event. While I stared blankly at him, he signed and looked away. Sorry, I didn't mean to make it weird. Then he got up to move. I got a hold of his sleeve and yanked him back down. Are you asking me to a dance? Which I probably said way too loud as everyone in the class looked over at us. Dell gave us a thumbs up. I'll allow it. I shot her a narrow-eyed glare. I didn't recall needing her permission. She just gave me an evil grin in return as her 2 sidekicks started whispering to each other. Neil blinked at me and looked down at the grip I had on his plaid shirt he was wearing like a jacket. Ah, yeah. I went with Dell last year so she could make an appearance, and I don't want to get roped into it again this year. Then he shrugged. Or have anyone else take you. He blushed, and I could feel my own face burn. I hastily finally let go of his sleeve. I don't know how to dance, and I need to focus on preparing for my tournament. I began twisting my hands together. But I do want to go. I'm going to need to find the time to get a dress too. Neil shrugged. I know it's going to be weird to say this, but you always look like you're dancing. Like every step you take is part of something deliberate and practiced. Even the first time I saw you putting your little brother in a shopping cart and playing with him as you pushed and picked out everything you were buying without even looking. I had never noticed all the little colored spots in the linoleum floor I was looking down at instead of looking at my just a friend. Okay, I'll go. But please stop talking? One day, I am so going to beat him up for springing this on me when the last thing I needed was a boy distracting me while I needed to focus on training. Where's the technique for this, Uncle Dave? I called him later that night and asked him for real. He said, traditionally you should meditate underneath a waterfall, still cold from the melting ice of the mountains in the spring, to focus your mind. He let out an amused huff of breath. I believe the modern recommendation is a cold shower. Good night, number 1 student. My mind sort of drifted for the rest of my classes that day. Should I look for something in green? Maybe light green, since the gym will have the lights dimmed down for a dance. What was Neil going to wear? Should I try to match? How are we getting to and from the dance? Do people still do the flowers on a wristband thing? Can Mom teach me how to dance? Does she dance? Should I have asked my parents before I accepted an invitation? It's not like we ever talked about dating rules. Austin managed to get close enough to me to shove me hard enough that I had to take a step away from him to regain my balance as I knocked his hand away and nearly punched him in the throat. What? What the heck was that for? Ryan started yanking on the larger boy's other arm. You've been ignoring us for the last 10 minutes, what's going on? I stared at the two of them blankly. I got a date? Austin threw up his arms as he made a sort of angry, grah sound and stomped off. Even Ryan rolled his eyes at me. Already, I thought we could do cool stuff for at least another year, now it's going to be just like Lord when she got all boy crazy and didn't want to hang out anymore? The red-headed girl on the bleachers looked up from her phone with an angry look. Shut up, Ryan, I'm not boy crazy, I'm just tired of doing little kid stuff. The smaller boy shrugs and swept his hand up at the still fuming girl as if to say, see. I had thought fuming meant smoking and being angry, but it specifically meant either irritating smoke or being so angry you couldn't think. Crossing my arms, I stared Ryan down. I'm not boy crazy either. It's just that Neil sprung it on me out of nowhere and I'm still trying to fit it into my head. I'm supposed to be in my first real tournament in not even 2 weeks, but it's more like a week and a half now, and I am under a bit of pressure since I'm representing my entire family and debuting as a person of interest to a whole bunch of shady, mysterious organizations. Ryan stared at me for a moment, then turned to shout up at Lord. That's a lot better reason to ignore your friends than saying video games are for little kids. The red-headed girl huffed at him and turned around on her bench to face away from him as much as she could. I looked around at the three of them. So you guys are friends? Austin made a disgusted sound as Ryan nodded. Up until you got here, we were the only supernatural people in our grade. And Lord got into it with Dell back when she was in elementary and her family had issues. So now she's distancing herself from us since she's on Dolores's hate you forever list. The little guy, even I had a few inches on him, turned to give the staring red-headed girl a determined look. I don't give up on my friends. Pack rats forever. He raised both his hands and rubbed his finger and thumb tips together like he was gesturing to get paid, while Lord stood and sniffed before shuffling out of the old gym. Austin had crossed his arms and turned his back on her. I walked over to sit down on the lowest bench of the bleachers. Well, that made my teenage drama seem awfully silly. Austin nodded at me. After seeing you fighting with your uncle, you get a free pass to get all girly and emotional now and then. But if you're done, I want you to show me that hop and turn with your arm swinging thing you did. Ryan informed his friend that, you're a dick, Austin. Much to the larger boy's bafflement. But Austin was right. I would have to talk to my parents about accepting a date without asking them about it, and I would have to talk to Neil about my dress, which I was sure he was going to get all boyish about having to participate in that conversation. But for now, my focus was going to be getting ready to fight highly trained teenage martial artists and show them how far me and my family was above them. You know, the fun stuff. My mom got a hold of my hair for a moment as she tried to get a knee into my guts. I got my forearm between us and pushed her knee aside before she was able to get any force into it. A spell I had worked out with Grandma Bree that made my hair nearly frictionless, so I jerked my head down out of her grip and nearly got her in the chin as I whipped my head back up. She stepped away. Your father is going to get weird about you going to a dance. He will be proud that you are confident enough to go, and he will be jealous. I began to circle her in what we called the family room, an open area with wooden flooring off of the kitchen with the piano nook on one end, the little greenhouse on the other, and a fireplace opposite the kitchen. Uncle Dave had nodded in approval when he saw the place. Fire opposite water, air opposite earth and wood. You will train yourself in the center of the world. I had considered that. What about metal? He grinned at me as he reached out to press his fingertip above my heart, then my forehead. Here, and here. I circled my mom. Why would he be jealous? She gave me a disappointed look. You are living his dream, doing normal kid stuff. Teaching children in his dojo will be the closest he has ever come to getting to play. Then she started chasing me around the room with a series of punches, elbow strikes, low kicks, and foot stomps. This is what the winter tongue will throw at you. Counter it. I started blocking at angles, pushing her with the motion of her blows, to force her to take more time to recover from her strikes. Outside, I heard my dad's van pull up, a Nissan Quest that had gotten my mom to start mocking him. Really, John, a wife wasn't enough, even your car has to be Japanese? He had grew up on martial arts films, it had left a mark on him. With a mutual nod, Mom and I bowed to signal it was the end of the training. I had also made it clear to both of my parents that I lose all trust in them if they tried to sucker punch me after formally ending a bout. I would be safe from a surprise attack at least until I was done helping to clean up after dinner. I wiped off some sweat with my towel and went to greet my dad at the door. Surprising him with a nod as he stepped in, then a full body hug. I'm sorry you never got to go to a dance. Or play a sport. Or be a band geek. You deserved everything. He had been on guard at first, braced in case I tried to throw him or something. Then he relaxed and pulled me in tight. But I kept holding on tight to him because it was hard to yell at someone when you're hugging them. I told him, Neil asked me to go with him to homecoming. I said yes, but I'm going to tell him we have to go as a group so it isn't a date. Can you drive us? He made an irritated sound, then lifted me off my feet before walking us over to the kitchen to talk to my mom. Did you put her up to that? I heard her laugh. Nope. But I have been teaching her to come up with a counter for a variety of styles. It may have gotten her thinking strategically. Dad tried to set me down, only to have me hang on to him. Are you letting go anytime soon? I shook my head, still buried in his shoulder, side to side. Not until you're not mad. He sighed and gave me a quick squeeze, before beginning to untangle me. I'm not mad, but you should have asked us before you agreed to anything. I stepped back with a nod and sniff. Why was I tearing up? He caught me by surprise, and I didn't want him to get all weird about it if I didn't lock him down with an acceptance. I figured it was better to tell him later that I had to tell him I was changing my mind because my parents told me I had to, then have him ask someone else before I could talk to you. Dad shushed me, which left me sputtering. Then took a long hard look at the top of my head before reaching out to grab my hair between his fingertips. Interesting, is that inner or outer magic? I don't know. Grandma talked me through it when I asked her how to do it, it's maybe a little of both. He got a weird look in his eyes, then nodded and smiled. I am so proud of you. Great, there goes the waterworks again. After a shower and dinner, handmade pizza rolls, Aaron's choice for his once-a-week pick, Dad coached me through some katas and showed me some of the moves he knew from the style of the groups he had gone up against from back when he participated in the tournaments. He had dropped out from doing them when Mom had gotten pregnant with me, and she had to stop, and he didn't think it was fair for him to go when she couldn't. But now? As we stopped to drink some water, he looked over at the house. I think your mom is getting fired up, which is weird since she always felt like the fighting was just showing off and letting everyone know the best way to fight you. I think it might be because all her cousins and aunties always saying she would start acting like a proper lady after she had a few kids. I struck a fighting poise, so I might have to go up against her someday. He shook his head. No, they never have people from the same school fight each other. And I'm not going to let you join my school, you're too far ahead of them. I hadn't really thought about being a part of his dojo, and he had never sparred with me, ever. My mom said he felt like he hurt my training by holding back too much. Instead, he threw me to Uncle Dave, who just made sure I knew self-healing techniques before he cranked up how hard he hit him. He waved at me to head into the house. It had gotten dark enough for the mosquitoes to come out. Not that they could break my skin, but it was creepy feeling them crawling around on me. I will ask you to come in and spar with them once they start thinking they're badasses. Getting knocked down by a little girl will keep their egos in check, and they may even learn something fighting someone closer to their skill. I frowned at him and he gave me an apologetic shrug. Relatively closer. I tried out some of the basic moves from other traditions my mom had shown me at a much slower speed on Austin and Ryan in gym the rest of the week. I wanted to see how they worked as the one who was doing them rather than dealing with them. The boys had obviously been practicing the moves I had shown them on each other, as they seemed to be using them more naturally rather than having to think about them as they did them. Are you two planning on joining my dad's dojo? They glanced at each other, then nodded at me. Don't try to use these moves, he'll probably show you some stuff that is even more basic than this because he wants to see how you move and react so he knows the best way to teach you. You're almost going to have to unlearn anything you pick up from me before he can really train you. That seemed to confuse the larger boy, but Ryan seemed to get it. It's like in games, you got to learn what works for you, not just try to imitate someone else. Even if you do imitate them at first, because that's how you figure out what works for you. A confrontation with Neil resulted in him sharing with me that he was going to wear black slacks and a matching tie, but he may have outgrown the blue sports coat he had gotten for his uncle's wedding 3 years back. Even if it had been big on him then. Try it on. Tonight. Send me a picture if it still fits. He seemed confused, and gave me a look like why are you making such a big deal about his? Which made me want to grab him by the head with both hands while I explained. Instead, I told him. Share this conversation with your mom, she'll fill you in on why this is important and if I am being weird or not. That weekend I was handed off into the merciless hands of my Aunt Rose. She looked at a picture of Neil in his black slacks, white shirt, black tie, and a comically undersized blue sports coat. He had a hangdog look on his face as the text explained his mom had made him get fully dressed up, and he struggled into the coat as a way of complaining. Only to have his mom insist on taking the picture. He also explained that he was being taken out on a shopping trip to buy a black sports coat so that I would be free to choose anything in the way of a dress since his mom said black matched anything. Aunt Rose nodded at the text. She's right, black goes with anything. The boy is a little young, isn't he? Shouldn't you be dating seniors? She tried to hold my phone up over her head with a grin like she was going to play keep away. I responded by making a fist and punching her in the stomach in slow motion. She frowned. I guess you're too old to play with like that anymore. Too bad, I'll miss you being a kid. Then she grinned. So I'll have to be twice as mean to Ami. Sorry sis, we all got problems. I think we spent the whole day in over a dozen boutiques in what may have been Paris, at least that would explain all the French people. At first, trying on all the outfits that Aunt Rose suggested, even the ridiculous ones, was fun. But I got tired of being a dress-up doll after an hour or so and started making some demands. I have to be able to kick. She tried to argue with me about it, but I shook my head. No one can ever know what may happen. I might need to be able to fight. Aunt Rose crossed her arms. It's a high school dance, as long as no one dumps a bucket of pig's blood on you, you aren't going to need to fight. I put my fists on my hips and leaned into her to whisper. It's a dance with werewolves, and high school boys, and mean girls. I want to be able to beat people up without ruining the dress I'm buying with my birthday money. My aunt suddenly taunted with anger, and her face went blank. There are girls being mean to you? I held my hands out. I only called them that because it's a group of popular girls that hang up with each other. The one in charge is kind of a friend. And the mean one is a learning experience. Trust me, Aunt Rose, I have to learn how to fight my own fights, even social ones, and some girl saying mean things to me is punching way below my level. She tilted her head at me. I think I'm going to like the adult version of my niece. Let's try a place I know in LA. The place in LA was at the end of an alleyway, around a corner, and had nothing at the rusty steel door to mark it as a store other than a button next to the door, and a camera above it. Pressing it, all Aunt Rose said was, "It's me." Inside, the place was huge, but more industrial looking than fashionable. And I got the feeling most of the staff was hiding as an older woman named Mary helped us. My request for something nice I could fight in didn't even raise an eyebrow. Of course. My dress was made up of a shiny material which I was a little hesitant to wear since I didn't want to show up anyone with something too expensive, no matter how much Aunt Rose urged me to do so. Whispering "give in to the dark side, show them the power of a fully operational debit card," was not helping me with my composure in a shop that I had noticed had concealable guns behind a thick glass panel, as well as disguised miniature tasers, pepper spray lipsticks, and pens. The steel corset provided tasteful bullet and stab-resistant garments for security-minded young ladies. Some of which, like the dress I had tried on, were not only stab-resistant but were in my size, and had discreet slits on the sides covered with an overlayer that would allow me to kick freely in all directions. After turning from side to check myself from every angle, I finally decided I'll take it. "Thank you for the birthday present, Aunt Rose." "Both of them." She waved my thanks away. "Are you talking about the sword spear ting? I worked on that to settle things between me and your uncle, and to hit on him. I'm pretty sure at this point that he's gay." I held up a finger and gave her a firm look. "I think a man not wanting to get involved with you only marks them as being smart, not gay." She gave me a brief little clap. 3 points for cattiness, 1 for accuracy. But too wordy. They packed up the dress. I would still have to pick out some shoes. And it turned out that it might have been better if I had worn it out. The dress still ended up being useful even inside of the box. As we stepped out the door, I moved forward and got it between me and the thrown knife as it went flying at Aunt Rose. It turned out the dress really was stab-resistant. My aunt had enemies, and some of them had caught up with her while we were inside. There were 3 of them, young, teens in fact, with bright red bandanas tied up as headbands. The leader, who had thrown the knife, was wearing a leather vest with no shirt on underneath. I mean, he was in great shape, but really? The guy was about Neil's age, maybe a bit older, and his 2 scared-looking backup guys looked even younger. The main guy had some hair on his upper lip, which looked like he had product on it to get it to lie flat. He was rubbing his forehead. It took me a month to get the money to buy that knife. It was supposed to be able to go right through a magical defense. And a little girl blocked it with cardboard. Aunt Rose was examining the very same knife which she had gotten a hold of without bothering to walk over to where I had sent it flying. "You got cheated. For one thing, you have to be holding it for the piercing effect to work, and I'm way too far above its maker's strength for it to have worked." She tossed the knife back at Vest Guy, who snatched it out of the air. "Sarah. Here's an extra on the birthday present. 3 members of the Cazador cartel. Enjoy." Then she took a step back and leaned up against the plain brick wall on the side of the entrance of the steel corset boutique. Then she waved up at the security camera overhead and shouted, "We got it." She raised an eyebrow at me as she held up her phone to record. "We do got it right?" I took a look at the boys, then reached behind me to grab the dark wooden shaft of my naginata as it rose out of my shadow. "Yeah, we got it." Holding my weapon tilted forward by my side, I bowed without taking my eyes off the 3 of them. Sarah Kane, head student of House Ichiban, granddaughter of the Grey Wolf. I will be your opponent today. I was going to have to remember to tell my grandpa that last title the next time he was nice. He would get a kick out of it. The leader guy stood up straight and returned the bow. "Juan Cortez, heir to the Cazador cartel. Jaguar warrior." And I have no interest in fighting you. My business is with your aunt? I nodded to let him know he had called it. She stole something from my family, and we want it back. Aunt Rose laughed. Your sister wanted to leave, all I did was give her a ride. She's in contact with your mom if you want to send her a message. But don't let that stop you, my niece needs to learn how she handled a real fight, even with the odds in her favor. Best guy, excuse me, Juan's two sidekicks didn't get an introduction and looked even more nervous as their leader scowled at me. We have her outnumbered, Bruja. A growl filled the alleyway, as Saku emerged from the shadows, behind a dumpster. My little puppy grew in size with each step as her growl grew deeper and her hair more shaggy. At the size of a wolf, she had blocked off any chance at their escape, and somehow I knew this wasn't even her final form. I held up the naginata in a high grip. It wasn't the best weapon for a fairly narrow alleyway, and it knew it. With a shimmer of the red light of hot metal, it seemed to twist as it shrunk in my hand. What I ended up with was a 7-inch-long single-edged knife made of black metal and wood. The letters CSA were carved into the handle on both sides. It was what I would have imagined the knife my great-great-grandfather would have used in the Civil War, even though I hadn't known he was on the wrong side. The same knife whose metal had been used to forge the head of my naginata. Tied by blood, the memory remains. My aunt had straightened up. Well, I didn't make it so it could do that. Who messed around with my enchantments? While I was checking out the balance, I muttered to her, it may have been you messing with someone else's work, auntie. I don't think they would have minded. One looked more jealous than scared. Nice weapon, good thing we both brought knives to a knife fight. But you aren't the only one who can switch things up, girly. He handed his knife off to one of his underlings, then threw out both of his hands, while he growled. Short little black claws stretched out from his fingertips, while his eyes went yellow. With cat-like slits. So, not a werewolf. A wercat? Oh neat, you can do partial transformations too. Can you do warform? The werewolves in my town didn't think it was real until my grandpa and his girlfriend changed to scare off a vampire. Do they crave your guy's blood too? Juan looked a little bemused, and my aunt laughed. Just kick his, but already, Sarah, he's trying to show off in front of his friends, and you're throwing him off. Put him out of his misery already. I apologized to him. Oh, sorry, and took up a guarded stance with my knife held close by the side of my forward right leg. I considered setting it aside since it seemed unfair to be armed while he only had his little claws, but I didn't want to look like I wasn't taking him seriously. His two friends stood awkwardly behind him, eyeing Saku, who was sitting while watching things with interest. As long as the two of them stayed out of it, it looked like my wolf-sized puppy planned on doing the same. One held up his hands, one forward to slash at my arms as I stabbed, the other high to slash downwards at me. My grandfather said the ability to change into a wolf was a werewolf's worst weakness since turning into what amounted to a big dog took away your ability to pick up a gun or jump in a car, which would be a major advantage against someone who was fighting on 4 paws. Teaching the werewolves in my school that some of them could grow claws may have been a mistake as well. Juan's ability to do so must have seemed so cool to him that he wanted to use them all the time. No kicks, no elbows, no knees, not even a headbutt. All he was doing was swinging his claws at me. No, no, no. Try backhanding me while you pull your hand back. Even if you don't hit, I have to do something about it instead of hitting you. You might get slashed, but you should be strong enough to heal from it even in a fight. You guys do heal fast, right? I shot that question to one of the backup guys. He hesitantly nodded, so I cut the back of Juan's hand. It stopped bleeding almost immediately. Good, you can take a hit. Just avoid getting stabbed somewhere vital. Juan snarled at me. He didn't seem to appreciate my pointers. The poor guy didn't really seem to have any training, so I cut up the front of his vest to teach him how open he had left himself. Which made me feel bad because when he rushed me and I tripped him, I could see the entire back of it was embroidered with the image of a black cat wielding one of those toothed swords the Aztecs used. I hoped the vest could be repaired. In the end, it was a question of who outlasted each other, and it was a question since Juan didn't look to be getting tired. So I let him catch me on my offhand with the tip of one of his claws. Stepping back, I showed him the freely bleeding wound. You got me, but I can hurt you a lot worse. Are we done? He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. I dropped my knife point down into my shadow and called Saku over to give her a good scratching behind the ear. Good girl, such a good girl. You can go back to puppy size, right? She can, right, Aunt Rose? My aunt shrugged. Don't ask me, I never go into homunculi, spirits, necromancy, or whatever else Andorra used to make her. Those are my mom's hobbies. She looked over at my still starring, huffing opponent. You're done right. I got to get her home for dinner. Her mom's making dumplings. Juan nodded. We're done. Then he bowed to me. Next time. The three of them left. Was that a challenge? My aunt shrugged again. Either that, or he was planning on hitting on you. Grab your dress, it should be okay. I frowned at my aunt, wondering if I should start including my age, 14, in my introductions. But she was right, the dress was fine. After dinner, my aunt, with Ami's help since Auntie was very old, ancient even, and unable to use simple technology and needed a small child to help her, hooked up her phone to the TV and showed off my fight with Vest Boy. My dad laughed almost all of the way through. Sarah, don't try to teach your opponent. It's not your job. Ami liked his vest. Aaron wanted me to show him when the knife turned back into a naginata. Mom gave me a sharp look that promised we would be having words about my fight. At least the dress was fine, the knife had barely even damaged the cardboard. I tried it on again that night because I knew Ami wouldn't stop bothering me about it until she got to see it. Then she had to hear all about my shopping trip, followed up with her demanding a promise to take her next time. I shook my head at her. They don't have dances at elementary schools, this was adult shopping. Maybe Aunt Rose could take you to someplace that makes clothes for little kids. I grinned at her. You could take Aaron with you. My little sister glared at me. You look like a frog in that dress. Then she ran off to her room, slamming the door behind her. I would have felt bad, but she deserved it. Little sisters always did. The next day I had to keep dodging questions from the werewolves. The notice at my dad's school had been up for a few days, promising to open that afternoon. All I could tell them that it would be a lot of repetition at first since they had to get the basics down before they got to spar. At least that's what was normally true, without getting hurt as a safety concern, they might get to skip a few steps. Or not. I guess if I was a teacher, I think I would make it a matter of discipline and not developing bad habits to hold off on sparring. Nicole hesitated at lunch, but I gave her a nod to sit down with me. After she settled her book in place, she folded her hands together. Are baseline humans going to be able to walk into your dad's dojo? I don't think I could keep up with werewolves, but I would like to see how he gets them started. I shrugged at her. I honestly don't know. But the worst that I could see him doing is asking you to leave. Do you know anything about the Casares cartel? She opened her carton of milk while she thought that over. I don't know about a cartel, but there's a Casares family that has had a presence in Southern California since the 1700s. They had an ongoing fight with several vampire lines over control of Los Angeles until they finally got pushed out. From what I remember, they avoided shape changing and kept the vampires from figuring out they needed silver to hurt them. Then she nodded to herself and asked. Why do you ask? I sipped my mixed fruit drink and winced. I had now tried it once, so now I could skip it for the next 5 years. Got into a scuffle with one of them with a grudge against my aunt. If he decides to hold a grudge against me as well, I want to know what I'm up against. Also, work at. I think. Nicole's eyes went wide as she nearly began to hop up and down in her seat in excitement. They're real? I thought it was just werewolves. I stared at her. So did I. I thought you would be more filled in on this sort of thing. She rolled her eyes. The Culper Ring is pretty new as these kinds of groups go, only 2,500 years old, they don't actually know all that much. And I don't get to see the official files unless and until I become an agent. We ended up agreeing to walk over to the dojo after school, instead of me going to the old gym and her heading home. She didn't have to call her parents with a change of plans. They want me to make friends, and they don't want the locals to think they don't trust me around them. Or at least that what I convinced them was good reason to trust me. Of course, by the end of gym class, Austin and Ryan had invited themselves along. And as we headed out, roughly half the werewolves, mostly the ones too young to drive, or at least with no access to their own vehicles, were walking along with us. With more questions. Everyone, really, I don't know. I learned from my mom and my uncle, so I don't know how my dad does things. And even if I did, he would train you guys differently from me. I can't heal as fast as you guys unless I completely focus on it. That's the one huge advantage you have over everyone. Change of subject, cats are real. Met one. Kicked his butt. That got a lot of questions, but at least they were new ones. Neil asked if I was okay rather than trying to get details about the fight. I showed him the back of my hand. Already healed, although I washed the heck out of it and put antibiotic on before I closed up the wound. Cat claws are supposed to be pretty nasty. He took my hand in both of his to take a closer look, which got Austin to complain, "We're going to learn how to fight, boy band, hold hands with her on your own time." Both of us blushed bright red and finished our walk about 10 feet apart. Nicole asked, "Can somebody smack him in the head? He's too tall for me to get enough leverage." Ryan covered it by jumping up high enough to swing down. The larger boy ignored the hit, other than looking back for a moment at Nicole to see who made the request. He stared at her for a moment. Pretty. Then kept walking. Nicole looked a little startled, then avoided looking in his direction the rest of the way there. The place was actually pretty crowded by the time we finally got there. The street had a lot of cars parked around, with people standing around outside. Who then began funneling towards the old fire station as my grandfather, in a white GI with a white belt, opened up the wide front doors. "We're open. Please take a flyer for when the classes start and the rates." All in all, there were about 50-some people crowded into the place, helping themselves to the platter with sausage and cheeses on crackers, as well as the freshly baked cookies, and a small sliced vegetable plate which I was fairly certain would end up going home with my dad by the end of the night. Untouched. Only about half the crowd was students from my school, some of which were not themselves werewolves. Others were mainly younger people like Dare, who was over by his sister Dell and her two friends. Then my dad dropped down from the hole in the ceiling at the end of the old locker room where the fireman's pool was supposed to go, and wasn't as yet back in place. "Welcome everyone. I realized that many of you are going to be new to learning martial arts, which puts us on even footing since I have never formally taught anyone." He walked out in the middle of the room. "I will be starting by only teaching a course on the basics of how to fight people without seriously hurting them. From there I will be developing a course of learning that focuses on each student's needs and talents. Later, I will be teaching some of you how to fight when your life is on the line, and you may have to end the life of another." Much later. Twisting his neck from side to side, it gave off a popping sound. Something my mom refused to let him do at home. He gestured over at my grandpa. "But first, I think we got some locals who want to take my measure. Please sign the waivers on the clipboard my dad has. I know which of you don't need to worry about getting hurt, but I want to take all the steps to make this look normal." A taller guy that resembled a 20-year-older version of Neil held out to hand to Grandpa for the clipboard. "I'll sign. I heard you had some shit to say about marine martial arts." He held up one of his feet and pointed at his boot with a questioning look at my dad, asking if he needed to take them off. My dad shook his head. "I brought these mats here to get them out of my dad's house since he won't throw them out, even though he already got new ones. Feel free to mess them up so bad he won't be able to them home when my new ones get here." That got a few laughs, and I nudged my grandfather in the ribs. Wow, it's like they've known you for years. My dad took his place on one end of the mats and gave a simple bow without breaking eye contact with his challenger, who surprisingly returned it in perfect form. Then they were on each other. If I had any doubts about this guy being a werewolf, they got answered pretty quickly. This was the first time I had seen a werewolf cutting loose. This guy had been fast, but the man I thought was Neil's uncle was even faster and knew what he was doing. I could tell my dad was holding back, but at the same time, he wasn't taking it all that easy on the guy. This was full contact. In less than 5 seconds, the guy was bleeding and had broken bones. Not that it was entirely one-sided. Dad may have been smiling, but his teeth were bloody and the other guy had gotten some other good hits in. The challenger was using a mix of various martial arts, especially judo grips, to try to hold my dad in place while the other guy tried to get a hit in. They went at it for about half a minute before they broke apart, clothes torn and blood-stained. My dad gave the other guy a grin. "You're good, but I'm done taking your measure. No disrespect, but I need to show off now." I was able to track my dad closing the gap between the two of them, but I'm not sure if anyone else did. Neil's possible uncle went flying into the red wall, which was clear of bystanders due to the mats being set up against that wall. There was a crunching sound as the cement blocks of the wall gave way. Surprising me, the uncle dropped down on his feet from the cracked wall with his guard up and managed to at least partially push away the next dozen or so attacks from my father so that the wall around him took more damage than he did. But ultimately, he just couldn't get free from being pressed, and eventually, something got through and dropped him down on his rear, still struggling to get up as my dad stepped away with a cold, analytical look on his face. The gym was pretty silent until Grandpa spoke up. "We all know you got more fight in you, Kurt. But I think my kid is trying to figure out how to hit you hard enough to get you to give up without killing you. How about you let someone else have a shot at him?" Grandpa looked over at another older man. "Is your dad ready to step up?" The older man raised his hands palms forward. "Oh hell no. I don't heal up like you youngsters. Also, I pigged out on the Gouda and spiky sausage cracker sandwich things, and I don't want to puke them up. Someone else want to take a shot?" Austin was already taking his socks off. Evans ran his hand down his face. "Austin? Really?" The large boy glared at his friend. "He's a teacher, that means it will be a learning experience." Then grabbed the smaller boy and threw him at my dad while yelling, "Get him." My dad caught the smaller boy with a full-toothed grin on his face and spun him upside down as Ryan tried to grab at him, before tossing the boy at Neil's uncle. "Catch please." Then swept Austin's legs out from under him as he tried to close in. He got as far as good hustle. Just before I realized how many boys, and some girls, were ready to jump in. Too many people, and Dad would have to hurt them unless he wanted to end up under a pile of werewolves. They would heal, but as my grandfather said, pain still hurts. So I stepped up. It wasn't all that different from Uncle Dave showing off group fighting. 3 at a time. Hold until I tell you that you can go in, step out if you go off the mat until I decide you can go back in. I pointed. Dell, Dare, and the you with the curly hair. In. Dell and her brother were fairly coordinated with each other as siblings would be, but curly hair just got in their way as Dad used him like a shield, pulling him around by his arms or shirt like he was an extra in a Jackie Chan movie. Whose action scenes Dad had used as part of his self-training when he was my age, due to a lack of instructors around to teach him as he was growing up in great-grandmother's hidden land. "Austin, get up and stop faking. He isn't going to let you grab at his feet and all you doing is being a tripping hazard for everyone else. You would have been off the mat if Kurt didn't catch you. Ryan, wait your turn to get back in." My dad spun Dare around by the wrist and let him go to hit the edge of the mat and roll off the edge, much to my recent next-door neighbor's frustration as he pounded his fist on the ground. As he finished his spin, Dad glared at me. "Sarah, stop helping them, you aren't the teacher here." I twisted my lips and thought that over, deeply enough that Grandpa selected the next 2 people to go in. Well, why aren't I? Or at least an assistant teacher. I am more than capable of teaching the basics while you focus on the advanced teaching. Dad pushed two teenagers off the edge of the mat with one of each of their arms locked behind their backs. Because you're underage to work for one. I threw up my hands at him, so what? Is Grandpa's girlfriend going to bust you? And I know people my age have paper routes. That's a job. He shot me a dark look. Can we discuss this after your tournament? You don't need the distraction right now. I glowered at him for a moment and then nodded. Fair enough. Glower, an angry or sullen look. With sullen being bad-tempered and sulky or gloomy. After another few minutes, it seemed like everyone who wanted to try at my dad had gotten their chance when almost every older werewolf in the room began looking around and sniffing at the air. My dad held up his hand. It's okay, I asked him to swing by. I wanted you all to see what I want to train some of you to be able to deal with one day, how far away you are from that level, and to be able to recognize his type by smell if you haven't met one before. A short thin man with his graying hair cut short stood across the street from the dojo and exchanged a nod through the open garage door with my grandfather and my dad. The man was wearing a simple navy blue suit and a red tie which he was carefully removing from his neck to wrap around his hand and stuff in his suit pocket as he waited. My dad began waving people aside from the path between the door and the mat. That gentleman is named Solomon Tuesday. At least at this time. My grandmother met him once when she was a little girl and he had business with her father. My grandmother hasn't been a little girl since the early 1500s. Dad looked around the room. He's seen centuries in which our various kinds were hunted, and he not only survived but saved others. My grandpa held out a round tin with the cap removed. Everyone who wants to stay and watch this might want to rub some of this under their nose. Sal will still smell pretty bad, but at least not badly enough to make you turn your stomach. No one left, or passed on rubbing some of the ointment my grandmother had made under their lip. My dad waved Mr. Tuesday over and into the dojo. He had a bit of a sandalwood scent to him. At least to me. Over the course of the fight, the red wall didn't hold up after getting used as a springboard or a target for the kicks, throws, and grapples. Neither did the ceiling which Mr. Tuesday took advantage of to fly up through after shaking hands with my dad when they called it a tie. Both of them had put on a good show of what supernaturals other than werewolves could do, techniques that could have passed for magic from my dad. And things out of legend as Mr. Tuesday left after images of himself made from fog left behind him as he moved faster than I could see. What was most impressive to me was that neither of them ever knocked or threw the other into one of the audience. This had been a highly staged demonstration instead of a spar. It was only a tie because neither one of them could cut loose enough to show their full strength. Austin looked down from where the vampire had flown up into the sky, then over to my dad. You can teach us to fight something like that? My father looked at him for a moment. Someone. And my goal is to teach you to survive someone like that. The large boy nodded after a moment. Good enough. For now. Ryan rolled his eyes at his friend. Why don't we try not getting knocked on our butts first? Get my ass. Austin grunted. Once again I was training with my mom, both of us in a close-up grapple. My mom was looking me straight in the eye as she instructed me. Let me lead, this is what Neil will be doing. Keep his one hand on your hip and don't let him slide it down, but get in a little closer. You're dancing, go by my hands to figure out where I'm going to move us next. I know it doesn't sound like much, learning to dance formally. But I had to do it in heels as well. Why do I need these things? I like that Neil is taller than me. Why do I have to compensate? My mom sighed. Because it makes your butt wiggle side to side when you walk. Which distracts foolish boys and stupid men. Like your father. I stared at her. Mom. She grinned, get your boy to walk down a hill in front of you, it looks good on men too. Spicy. Nope. Not asking about my dad walking down hills. And I was always going to go first on a hill with my family from now on. The tournament was in 2 days, and I would be going straight from school in one of the 10-person used rental vans my grandfather had bought in the hope he would have many more chances to drive that many people around. I had to remind my dad when he gave it a thoughtful look that I still wanted a 2-seater convertible at 16. For his sake, I hoped he was joking about how I should get a learner car first that I didn't mind getting into a few minor accidents with before I got something nicer. I just shook my head at him. I have a witch for a sister, an aunt, and a grandmother. They can fix a scrape. At least I think they could. Grandma wasn't much for technology, Aunt Rose was more of a destroyer than a fixer, and Ami might refuse to spite me. Most of the rest of the students, teens, and adults, were making the drive to Chicago in the most reliable of the high school buses. While me, Dell, and her 2 friends, Austin, Ryan, and Dare were taking the van with Dare driving. Along with my grandpa riding shotgun since he had the map. An actual placemat-sized book of maps. Which I mocked. Grandpa, we have maps on our phones, everyone has maps on their phones. We don't need, I wave my hands at the book. That. He blew through his lips at me. Nonsense, these maps got my family all over the country when we were kids, they can guide another generation. I did the mental math. It's 60 years old. Are those even the correct states on there? My parents were driving their Nissan with my sibling in it and Melinda, the little girl from next door, since Dare asked if they could take her since she was giving him the silent treatment at not being able to go along with him. The dojo wasn't taking kids that young, even if she was stronger at the age of 8 than some of the adult werewolves in town. She was going to be even more of a terror as she grew up and came into her power. Maybe she could represent Dad's school then. A carload of my cousins joined the caravan as we pulled out of town. While they would be cheering me on, they weren't here for me. Outer magic workers like Ami were rare. Rare enough for someone desperate to try to grab her even though she was the daughter of a man who was known and respected internationally as a troubleshooter, the niece of someone feared worldwide, and the great-granddaughter of someone who was feared in both this world and many others. But then that meant some people might just see her as an easier target to harm than everyone who cared about her. Maybe she could just stay home, I didn't really need my parents there just to see me fight. I leaned forward in my seat in the first row of the van and whispered. Saku, guard Ami. There was the sound of a soft and distant yip. It was about a 2.5-hour drive to Chicago, so of course my grandfather insisted we stop for lunch, his treat. I wanted to argue with him, but the werewolves were making puppy dog eyes at me. I got 2 of the chicken burgers at White Castle. I didn't want anything that might get stuck overnight when I might be getting kicked in the stomach tomorrow. Me and my family were staying in the Congress Plaza Hotel in one of the suites set up for the contestants. All the werewolves had a set of rooms at the Knickerbocker, with Grandpa and Dare chaperoning. Dad had gotten the rooms there for free since Grandma had a long-standing offer for a permanent room there, which she had never claimed from her yearly updates to the place's wards. So the management was delighted to be able to do something to keep on her good side. Really, she just did their wards for free since some friend of hers lived then year-round and she wanted them to be safe. I would have liked to stay with my friends instead of my family, and I would have Saturday night unless I was hurt badly enough that I needed Grandma to watch over me. But Friday night I had to attend a dinner with my parents, while Grandma and Aunt Rose watched over Ami and Aaron. At least I should be able to eat something healthier than fast food. And I got to wear my new dress, with flats. Black ones. Mom had packed the matching high heels, but somehow they vanished from my suitcase. I just hope Saku didn't leave any tooth marks on them. The dinner was nice, at least as far as the food. High protein, fresh vegetables, and a decadent dessert of rich, thick, chocolate fudge cake with buttercream frosting and caramel drizzled on top. My grandfather would have made fun of me for not only eating my cake, but savoring it as well. But my parents had been in training most of their lives. They understood you had to earn your rewards and enjoy them as much as you could. Other than that, too many people, most of whom seemed to know and either hate or fear my family, with a few that praised them and my grandmother. While not mentioning Aunt Rose or my great-grandmother. I also was introduced to many of the people I would be fighting, some of who seemed dismissive of me, while others carefully shook hands with me as we took each other measures. Are they better at concealing their strength than me of something? Or are they all really that weak? One of them, a younger woman, my dad seemed surprised to see. Nina? I'm glad to see you. I didn't think you were a fighter? The pale girl Latino girl tilted her head down in embarrassment. I'm not, but it's so rare for one of my kind to be under 18, they asked me to compete. I think they hope I'm strong and fast enough to make up for it. My dad gave her a stern look. There will be some blood spilled, and you're very young to stay under control after how quickly you were turned. She gave him a wide-eyed look and shook her head. Oh no, no. If I feed before the fight and every round or so if I win, it's easier to keep in control because I'm young. I can't drink all that much blood, not like the elders. She held her hand in front of her belly. They can swell up this big, they are like garrapata. Ticks. I think the girl wanted to chat with my dad for longer, but my mom caught up with us and gave the girl a smile with all of her teeth while dragging my dad off. She sighed. Looking over at her, I asked, "Vampire?" The girl nodded after giving me a long stare. So I did warn her. I got a lot of werewolves here to root for me. I don't want to offend you, but you might want to keep your distance tomorrow. Her eyes went wide. Werewolves are real? I sighed. I swear, we need a handbook or something. The two of us talked for the rest of the evening. She kept me from any more introductions from my parents since my mom was keeping my dad on the far side of the ballroom. And we got to exchange a few bits of information neither of us had ever heard from our own kind. The elevator stopped halfway to my floor and 4 men stood outside. Black suits. Black sunglasses. Black gloves. Black tasers. Black clubs. And a black sack the size of my head. Oh. Ami wasn't the only target in my family. I exhaled as I entered bullet mode. The scrolls I was allowed to examine called it The Dance Between the Raindrops, but Uncle Dave renamed it to something easier for my generation to visualize. Really, it was more like my parents' generation, but when I pointed that out, he showed me just how much faster he was than me by flicking my forehead. Then he claimed that was level 1. My chi flowed around me and was pushed along with my breath. And I could see by the way the men stood that they were definitely here for me as the first 2 lunged forward with cracking tasers in their hands. The technique to carry an electric charge across the skin, and to slow it down until you made contact with an enemy and let them take the hit was not something I had been trained in yet. First I had to learn how to carry a blow against me without crossing my heart before I would be taught how to do the same with lightning. Instead, I brushed my left hand over the right to block the light from the ceiling above in order to pull the dagger form of my naginata from out of the shadows and into my hand, then swept my left hand out to knock one taser aside while reaching out to drag the tip of the dagger over the back of the other man's hand. The tip of it slid open both his black leather glove and the flesh below so deep that I could feel it bounce over his finger bones. Then I kicked the guy next to him's knee in the side and saw his leg begin to buckle as the joint bent inwards with a snap. Then I followed that kick with a spin around and jumped high enough to put my knee into the face of the man, dropping his taser from his bleeding hand, smashing him up against the side of the elevator doors. I inhaled. The 2 men behind them pulled the first 2 men back and I faced off against them for a moment. Flipping Goryu over the dagger landed point first and vanished into the darkness within my cupped hand before I crossed my arms and leaned against the back of the elevator until the door shut between us. I wonder what the hell that was about. Oh, hey. Free taser. Which had a few drops of blood on it, and that was a good thing since the dagger was completely clean of all blood. I stared at it. No. No drinking blood and then trying to mentally influence me to stab more people. Behave. I wasn't sure if that was a real danger, but I thought it was best to set ground rules now, just in case. Examining the black metal of the knife, I realized I really needed to name it to make it my own. Void? No, it has a history. The metal and the magic each came from 3 branches of my family tree, all coming together. What did you call it when 2 rivers merged? I checked on my phone. Convergence. Or something pronounced like Goryu in Japanese, which sounded appropriately violent in English. Goryu. Nice. At the door to the family suite, I pressed my hands against the door and pushed my magic out beyond my skin. Grandma answered the door with a smile, which fell as she grasped my arms and lifted them up while looking me up and down. Before spinning me in place, then pulling me in tight, with my face pressed into her shoulder. Why am I shaking? Aunt Rose's magic filled the room as she linked herself more strongly to the room's wards. Blood has been spilled. It's not hers, right, Bree? Brianda? Talk to me. Grandma pulled me into the room, the door slamming shut behind me with a glance from Grandma. Sukka began to circle the room, growling with a sound that shouldn't be that loud or deep from a puppy. While Aunt Rose pulled the taser from my hand, regarding the smear of blood on it with a grin. Oh, I have you now. You son of a shoot, I guess I can't say that anymore. The bitch is on our side. Grandma reached out to place her hand over the taser and lifted it away to gaze down at the wet red stain on her hand. I have them. She looked her younger sister in the eye. My granddaughter. My bloodline. I claim vengeance by my hand. She walked me over to sit on the couch. They don't fear our family enough, not all of us. It's time to remind them that nice is not weak. My grandmother looked at her sister. Call my son, guard the children. Then she walked over to the windows which opened before her as her peasant blouse, shawl, and long blue skirt turned into some things darker and older looking as she lifted free of the floor with one hand gripping an ancient-looking broomstick as she drifted out into the air. Holding up her blood-stained hand, she regarded it, then the air shimmered around her as she vanished away. Aunt Rose closed the window and pulled out her phone. Idiots. Never anger the healers, they know the worst ways you can be hurt. I learned a new word that evening. Fugue. Ami and Aaron were sitting beside me, arms wrapped around me. I don't remember them joining me on the couch. Then Mom had Aaron on her lap as she pulled me in close as I cried and babbled about how it felt, cutting skin and breaking bones. The way the bones in the man's face shattered under my knee. My dad and Aunt Rose arguing about him going out looking. She cut one, there should be a blood trail. My dad can follow them anywhere. I laughed at the idea of my silly old grandpa, all hairy in his war form with blood all over his hands and teeth. The laughter just wouldn't stop. No, Dad, don't take Grandpa, he won't hold back. He won't be him anymore. Then Aunt Rose was giving me a scared look as she pressed two fingertips against my forehead. Sleep without dreams, Sarah. I woke up to the sound of snoring, and a cold nose pressing into my neck. Ah, Saru. Stop, no kisses. As I sat up, I saw my grunkle Drew waking up with a confused look from the padded chair he had been sleeping in. No one else was in the room I was supposed to be sharing with Ami. My grunkle gave me a bleary-eyed look. I guess one of the advantages of being a werewolf is being able to sleep in an awkward position without getting a stiff neck. He stood and stretched as I frantically reached for my phone. Relax, kiddo, you got a good 2 hours to eat something light, hit the toilet, get dressed, and get to the opening ceremony. Or whatever order you like to do things in. I could feel the pajamas on me, so I pulled back the covers and rolled out of bed as Saku attacked the light blanket and top sheet. No offense, Grunkle Drew, but why are you here? He gave me a tight grin. Here in Chicago? Because I wanted to see my niece in her first tournament. Here in your room? Because I'm the one you need to talk to right now, or rather listen to. Sitting back down in the chair, he took a deep breath. You and I. We're not like your dad or my brother. When they have to get violent, to hurt people, or worse. They can go cold. They can feel nothing as they physically destroy someone's body or their life. Then just go about their day. I sat back down on my bed, Saku curled up next to me as I absent-mindedly pulled her half onto my lap and began petting her. He gave me a moment. Your mom, other people. They can train their whole lives and never have to use their skills, others get into their first life or death fight, I filched. He paused and looked down at the ground. As an adult has better tools to deal with having to hurt someone. My grunkle clasped his hands together. I was 17 when I killed a man for the first time. Then I had to make sure he wasn't going to get back up. I didn't have time to deal with it, I had to go and try to kill some more people. It messed me up for a long time. He got up and sat next to me, pulling me in close with one arm. 4 full-grown men tried to kidnap a 14-year-old girl, and you stopped them. They were bad men, and you were clearly the good guy. I began to shake a little, and he pulled me in tighter. You used enough force to stop them while protecting yourself. And you held back so they could have a chance to heal and learn not to pick fights with little girls. But even when you did everything right, it still sucked. Because you're not a natural killer. Same as me, same as the overwhelming majority of people in the world. But you didn't freeze up either, you stopped the bad guys from doing a bad thing to you. You had the right to use violence against them, and even to hurt them. To make them stop. And everyone who matters will tell you the same as many times as it takes to get that deep down in your head where you just want people to be decent human beings and don't want to accept that sometimes they aren't. I wiped at my eyes, then hugged my grunkle tight enough to make him wheeze, and Saku whined since she was stuck between us. Thank you, Grunkle Drew. Now get out of my room, because I want to jump in the shower. There were more hugs from my family as I tried to get ready until it started to be too much. Alright already. I had a bad time and I'm over it. Now I got some fights. I stopped for a moment, remembering the feeling of other people's bones breaking. Then I took a deep breath. Some fights I'm looking forward to. Looking around, I noticed that my grandmother was missing and gave my dad a questioning look. He shrugged. No clue. When she's on the job, she can be gone for months until she gets done. Heading downstairs, my dad wrapped an arm around me and held me back as the rest of the family got into the elevator. Just need a word with Sarah since I haven't had a chance to talk to her yet. My parents exchanged a nod as the door closed. He set his hands on my shoulders. I'm sorry. I don't understand why you got upset over last night. Everyone, including Rose, explained it to me, but I'm just not capable of getting it. Stepping back, he looked at me, like he did his students. I am so proud of my daughter's courage and skill. You are still my little girl, somewhere inside this young lady, this proven warrior standing before me. He bowed. You are welcome to assist me in teaching others. And I will train with you as a martial artist. I bowed in return and rushed forward to hug him. Tightly enough to make it hard for him to get away. How much does it pay? We bargained on the free membership and an extra 20 a week on my allowable. I didn't try to bargain him up in pay since I still had a few thousand on the debit card from Aunt Rose. I just needed a legitimate income to cover up how much money she had given me. They had rebuilt the theater after the Great Fire. One of those levels had some bad things happen before new management took over, but the arena was still useful even if the fights were no longer to the death. I got a few final hugs, against my will, Mom, Dad, not where the other magic warriors can see me. Then I joined the other 48 teenagers making their way to the blue and red crosses made on the floor out of duct tape. I gave the vamp girl a smile and a wave, but placed myself on the other side of the crowd from her, just in case they paired people up by who they ended up standing by. There were some cheers from the second higher tier of the stadium-like seating, where a pack of students, pun intended, were waving and holding up a banner saying Sarah Kane, in green on a long white length of cloth. With best wishes, calls for butt kicking, and both hand and paw prints painted on it. My grandfather was holding up one corner and giving me a concerned look until I gave him a nod. Then he turned to deal with a guy in a black suit with a blue and red armband who Grandpa was leaning away from, along with all the other werewolves. Vampire security guard. Neat. I mean, they were hosting, so obviously they would handle problems with their own people. And my werewolves weren't the only ones looking like they wanted to hold their noses or wave away a bad smell. Then a guy in a fancy red suit with a blue tie floated down from the ceiling seeming to be using a microphone's cord to hold his weight. Welcome ladies, gentlemen, and everyone else too numerous to list. We are so glad to see such a large crowd showing up to the junior tournament, both in the audience and the number of contestants. It looks like we have the start of another generation of young people willing to openly participate in the spirit of competition. So without further ado, lights snapped on overhead. 2 beams of red light shined down on 2 of the people around me and 2 blue lights on another 2. Lights of each color were shined down on squares of stone about twice as big as a boxing ring that rose out of the ground with grinding sounds. A man and a woman emerged from doorways to stand in the middle of each square and began calling out the names of the people lit up from above as the first 2 sets of contestants. The announcer began talking again. Due to the number of contestants, we're going to have to double up on the sparring squares to get through everyone before noon. Our apologies if anyone misses anything noteworthy because they're watching the other fight. But recording of the highlight will be available in the lobby by the start of the senior matches. All for a low, affordable price. After confirming that I was up again after 2 more sets of matches, I, along with half of the remaining contestants and their attendants, was waved into a long corridor lined with benches opposite TVs showing the matches. One of the first 2 fights ended pretty quickly. A tall boy let a smaller kid take 3 swings at him. Then as the smaller kid backed up, the taller one gave him a nod and then snap kicked the smaller boy off his feet, dropping him hard. The larger kid then advanced to pin the smaller one down with a knee and then stopped, posed with a fist ready to smash down into the smaller boy's face. The 2 of them exchanged a few words, then both nodded as the smaller boy yielded with a red face and a frown. Although upset, he still exchanged blows with the taller boy. The other fight went on for a while. A huge hulking guy with a shaved head was fighting a tall Asian girl with light brown hair. The girl was better and fought with a similar style to my own, but the guy was taller, nearly as fast, and a whole lot stronger. He could also take a hit, as he proved, with the girl landing blow after blow, twisting and spinning to get in close, strike, and then get clear. If this was being judged on points, she would have already won. But the purpose of these fights was to prove who was the best in a real fight, not just a spar. Then she got a hold of one of his fingers, and put her whole weight into an elbow smash on the top of his arm, snapping his still grasped finger flat to the back of his hand. The huge boy's eyes went wide as he flinched back and brought his hand back to his chest as if to protect it, opening himself to let her drop to one knee as she punched him in the groin with a cracking sound. I was really hoping that was his athletic cup going and not his pubic bone. Surprisingly, the guy wasn't out, not until he took another few hits and then got knocked to the ground and an older man stepped onto the square with a shout. The woman refereeing the match called it a win for the girl. Of the 4 people in the first matches, she had done the best, but I was fairly sure I could have taken her unless she was holding back to surprise someone later in the tournament. A few staff members with buckets of soapy water and sponges took a moment between the matches to clean up the droplets of blood that had been spilled. Uncle Dave was suddenly by my side. "Hit me." I looked at him. "You were supposed to meet me down here before the fight started. You suck as a trainer and an uncle." He sighed. "Physically hit me. I want to be sure you aren't going to hold back after last night." "Oh." I used the bench to get some height and tried to put my elbow into his temple, landed and spun to try to put my foot in his stomach, and then sent a punch at his throat. Nothing landed, but he nodded in approval. Then, after a moment of staring at the floor, he grunted and jerked his head at the screen showing some highlights of the fight between the girl and her opponent. My granddaughter, Elise. I was never invited to meet her, so I took the chance to introduce myself. I stared at him for a moment, then turned to look down the corridor as he locked eyes with a mixed-race man with the look of my family, right down to the glare he was shooting at Uncle Dave, who in turn ignored him as he bowed to the girl from the last fight, following along behind the glaring man. "You fought well, girl. You are a credit to yourself and your family." My uncle shook his head. "My mother still misses you and always showed you kindness and affection. She would be overjoyed to hear from you and to meet her great-granddaughter. If you must insult me, call me an asshole, and leave the rest of our family out of it, Thomas." The man glared one more time before turning to grasp his curious-looking daughter's shoulders, to turn her away and rush her off. Watching the two of them walking off, I poked my uncle in the shoulder. "I'm not going to hold back on her if we end up in a match. I think she has some moves she's keeping in reserve." He growled. Yes, her grandmother was the same. He turned to look down at me with a slight narrowing of his lips that passed for his smile. "Show her family their due respect. Take her down." I ended up missing most of the second-round fights, due to the distraction, and then I found myself standing next to Nina as the two of us waited for our opponents on the opposite of the arena. Thinking about how she had no, or very limited training to fight, I offered up some advice. "Smile and wait." Nina gave me a nervous look. "What?" "Moving around, or trying to use a defensive stance will let people tell that you don't have much training. Just stand in one spot and let them come in. You'll either be faster than them and can get in one hard hit when they get close, or they will get a free hit on you. But you can take a hit better than a human. Be patient and react, then go after them, hard. Don't give them time to think." I nodded to myself, then second-guessed my advice. "Unless someone who knows more than me gave you some other advice." "If they did, do that." She smiled and covered her mouth. "Thanks, Sarah. My mentor just told me to kick them between the legs, man or woman, then grab hold and keep punching them until they go down." Which, really, was pretty good advice. But then we were being called up north. Sarah and Dora Kane of House Ichiban. I stepped up on stage. My mom insisted on including my middle name to make it clear I was connected to great-grandma. South. Irving Kaleberg of the Dakota Thing. My opponent stepped up on the other side of my square. And I thought my cousin had been at a size disadvantage. Irving was well over 6 foot but was still young enough that he wasn't filled in all the way. And he would be terrifying once he did, since he was already muscular as hell as he stood there in a brown and yellow singlet. The pale-skinned giant had nearly white silver-colored hair and even had some darker gray facial stubble already at his age. As well as a confused look on his face. "You smell of wolf?" "Oh. Is he?" "Friends and family. Come talk afterwards, I brought a bunch of them. The girls will like you." Then was time to fight. If I had to fight this guy in real life, I would have already gotten out my naginata, both to keep him at a distance and do some damage to get him bleeding and weaken him. But using a weapon in these fights was an admittance that you were too weak to do it with your own strength. My dad bought into that kind of thing. My mom, despite all her training, had typically used a gun in her real fights. At least at the start of a fight. As she put it, "Things get messy." The referee held her hand up between us, then swung her arm down as she raced out of our way. I had often noticed that after someone called for a spar to start, people would switch from a relaxed guarded stance to a ready-to-fight stance. Irving had switched from an intimidating horse stance that showed off the muscles in his arms to something where he held his hands up ready to smack me, the smaller person, aside as I tried to get close enough to do something. More like he was offering his fingers as a target, like getting a finger broken was an irritation rather than a debilitating injury. Werewolf. Ding, ding, ding. He's fighting like a werewolf. But instead of taking a ready stance, I just stood there. Relaxed and uncommitted. And he again looked confused, uncertain. Unready. I charged in, screaming, with my defenses wide open and focused on the space between his hands. A grin on my face. This was a fight, not a life or death battle. We both were out here to win, not to injure, not to kill, or to take away someone's freedom. Just to beat the crap out of each other to find out who was better. I leaped forward, twisting as I went. To land on my side as I slid into his left ankle even as I was wrapping my arms around his right leg as I finished my slide underneath him, got my feet beneath me, and stood. Lifting his leg up backwards as I went. He shouted, "Hey," and twisted around so that while I had his leg up to my waist, he was now facing me. But I kept lifting and got my shoulder under his ankle while lifting his leg up and then kicking his other leg as he went off balance. Wide-eyed, and with a look of angry disbelief, Irving went over backwards. Digging my feet in, I managed to drag him halfway to the edge of the square, keeping my body to the off side of his leg to keep him from kicking me with the other. Until he pulled himself up from the waist, then threw himself back long enough to brace himself to lift me off the ground with his leg. I let go and he rolled away, to keep me from getting his leg again, but opened himself up to a knee into his ribs as I tried to drop on his back. Then I had to push away from him as he tried to elbow me in the side of my knee. He pushed himself up into the air with his hands, but I went inside his reach to grab his head with both hands and pulled my knee up into his face. I was trying for his throat, but he dropped his chin. I felt the bone in his nose break under my knee and hesitated. Grabbing me by the hips, Irving raised me above his head and threw me 20 feet into the air, and a good 15 feet past the edge of the square. Detya slid through my fingers ahead of me until I shifted my grip on it and grasped the end of the shaft. I drove the tip a full foot deep sideways into the stone floor of the arena, pulled on the end of the handle, and braced my feet against the bending shaft as I threw my weight against the end of the pole before it snapped straight, sending me flying back onto the square, nearly in the same spot I started in. I nodded to Irving and took up a fanciful stance on one foot, and the tip of my toes on the other foot. Grinning, I beckoned at him with one hand. Nice, but we're not done yet. He returned his grin and began to walk straight at me as a whistle blew. The female vampire stepped up between us. Hold. Miss Kane left the battle square, but without touching the floor of the arena. We need a call from the judges. I straightened up awkwardly as me and my opponent exchanged disappointed looks. Irving waved his hand around dismissively. I'm good. A real fight wouldn't be in a defined area to fight. He shrugged. And I got to see a for-real magic weapon. The referee took her hand off her earpiece. The judge's call is that since getting knocked out of the square rule was just to keep the fight in the arena. So if you can get back onto the square without touching the floor with your body, the fight continues. She had each of us. Ready. We both took our stances. Fight. I broke his thumb when he tried to grab me again. He busted a rib with a swift knee to my side. I got a hold of his arm and used it as a fulcrum to launch myself up to twist in the air and knee him in the face, before using his arm again to kick my way clear of his hands. In the end, I was the better fighter. I was more skilled and just as strong. He was bigger and could take a lot more damage, but he was so focused on the fight that he didn't notice he had run out of room on the battle square until he stepped back to brace himself and found his foot dangling in the air. I gave him an apologetic look as I jumped up and mule kicked him mid-torso with both feet toppling off the square. As he scrambled to his feet still looking confused, I gave him a deep bow, which after a moment he returned. Then he stepped up to the edge of the square with his arms out and I stepped forward to return the hug, with my head still barely reaching his chin. He spun me around, yelling, "Damn it, I'm aging out of the junior fights next year, how long until you're in the adult league?" I managed to yell, 4 years. Before, we got chased off the arena floor by the officials so the next group could fight. Heading into the hallway with the TVs, my family was waiting for me. I looked at them with a wide grin. This is what I came here for. Of course, Uncle Dave and my mom tore into me for playing around. But my dad just grinned and gave me a hug. I managed to get a half hour to hit the girls' room, drink some water, and take the time to focus on healing my rib and various bruises while eating an energy bar that Grandma Kane had made, which my dad swore by. Which reminded me. Is Grandma back? My dad shook his head. No, but she's fine. She started with the leader of the cabal and is working her way down. I took a deep breath. I don't want anyone dead. They failed. I hurt them, and Grandma made the person in charge suffer. It's enough. My dad laid his hands on my shoulders. She isn't killing them, Sarah, that's not my mom's way. She cursed them with sterility. They threatened a child, now they don't get to have any more of their own. By the time she's done, everyone in that group families will come to an end when their youngest children die out. If they want to be forgiven, to have to ask you to accept their apology after you come of age. Each and every single one of them. My mom hugged me from behind while she whispered in my ear. When they come, make them pay. Cash. And lots of it. I blinked. It didn't seem right to make a kid pay for what some nasty old person did. But then I was going to be the one to choose what they had to do to get grandma to take her curse away. A few years in the Peace Corps sounded good. The remaining fights for the first round were done by the time I was out of the restroom. 48 fighters were now down to 24. And in my next fight, I was up against a guy in full tactical gear. No weapons, but he did have some high-tech body armor, and gloves made to concentrate force on the caps over his knuckles. It helped him a bit. I had to start with some lighter hits until I got a good feel for how hard I could hit him without killing him, then a 3-hit combo of strikes to the gut, face, and finally a leg sweep was enough to put him down. 12 left. Nina caught up with me. Pouting. I won my first fight by doing just what you said, but I knew it wouldn't work on the next fight, so I just tried to wrestle and punch on the next one. But I couldn't get the right leverage to use my strength, and eventually, I got tired of getting punched in the back of my head. I patted her on the shoulder. You still got 2 years before you age out, right? By next year you'll know how to really fight. She forced a smile on her face as she thought that over. Then genuinely grinned. Yeah, I can do that. They called the first contestant for the 3rd round, then me. I was up. If this was a story, then in the 5th round I would have lost to my cousin, but with the tournament down to 3 people, I would have gotten to fight her a second time, win, and have the whole tournament down to me and the 3rd person who had already beaten her for her first loss. This would have been so much more satisfying. Instead, I lost my next match to a girl named Indara Singh who was representing the School of 5 Rings. I was faster, stronger, tougher, but she had 3 more years of training at the same level of effort as me. She was just plain old better than me when it came to fighting. Not by much, I don't think, because I got plenty of punches in, but better enough to win. I got knocked down and she followed me down to punch me in the face as I tried to sit up, knocking the back of my head into the stone floor of the square. The next thing I knew, Uncle Dave and my dad were lifting me and carrying me out of the arena, with Dad trying to reassure me that I had done good, and Uncle Dave giving his head a slight shake when I looked over at him. Then I was sitting on one of the benches focusing my chi on my head while sipping some water from a porcelain bottle my grandmother had handed me. Huh? Grandma? She smiled and reached out to hold her hand to my forehead. The Benito family is no longer a danger to you. Focus on your head, darling. That's when I mentally caught up. Crap. I lost. There was an exchange of concerned looks over my head from the adults standing around me, and I had to lean around to see the current fight between the girl, Indara, who had beaten me, and a skinny guy with a length of chain with weights on the end who was doing better against her than I had. I'm not the best yet. I grinned, but it was still fun. Uncle Dave gave me a thin-lipped nod and a grunt of approval. There is another tournament in Hong Kong in 2 months. As well as a side tournament for those with less to prove. He glanced at my parents. With your permission? My dad started to speak before Mom cut him off. We'll talk about it later. I caught the last of the matches between the last 6, then headed up to where everyone from the school was watching, with the banner with my name rolled up. Before anyone else could say anything, Austin made a dismissive sound at me. You got beat by a girl. My jaw dropped open as he shook his head sadly and crossed his arms. Then I rolled my eyes and laughed as Ryan began beating his friend over the head with a program and the other teens pelted him with popcorn. My stomach growled, and Neil handed me the remaining half of his paper sack of salty, buttered, incredibly unhealthy kernels, which I demolished before the last round even started. Elise fought against a tricky guy who used a form of Brazilian and monkey style, but she focused on just snapping out simple punches and kicks to keep him from setting up any fancy moves. Then she went right into a fight against Indara. Kick her ass, Elise. Everyone in my group in the stands looked at me. I shrugged. Cousin. They nodded, then jumped up and started cheering for Elise as well. The girl didn't look up, but she seemed to blush a bit. She still lost. Indara went on to demolish Flippity-Flop Pity Chain Guy. Then she got a breather before she and Elise got a rematch to settle the tournament. Excuse me guys, I think I saw something that I want to pass on. Down in the south hallway, I approached Elise's family with a nod and wave of my hand to dismiss her father's look of recognition that quickly turned dark. Sorry, I don't know what happened between you and your father, but that's between you and him. Me? I'm here to speak to my cousin. Uncle Dave's father looked a little bemused at that, but he let me slip past him to plop down on the bench next to Elise. Hi. I'm Sarah, a cousin on your dad's side. I don't know if you picked it up, but she goes off balance just before those punches of hers come flying in out of nowhere. I'm thinking you could focus on putting her even more off balance when she tries it. She frowned, more in concentration than offense. That sounds right. At least enough to try. I nodded at her. I'm sure I'm not the first person to notice, so she just about has to have a backup strategy. Also, I've been informed that me and a bunch of people from my high school are signed up for some volleyball games this afternoon. There are more than 2 teams, but I don't think it's as organized as a tournament. We have more people than we need for one team, so we could use a few extra people to field a second team if you're interested. See ya. Elise looked startled, then let out a laugh as I ran off. I wanted to get back up in the stands before the last fight. My grandfather had spent the same break between rounds dragging off Ryan and Austin to help him carry back a tray full of hot dogs. There were even 2 left for me by the time I got back. Thanks, Grandpa, but I only need one to hold me over for lunch. He nodded at me. I know. Then snatched up the last hot dog. Biting into it as several of the other werewolves gave him looks of betrayal. Elise knocked Indara sideways and broke the other girl's leg as they went down to the ground. Whatever plans Indara had for after her trick stance was caught out looked like it relied on having 2 working legs. She still dragged the fight out for another half a minute, before one of her group finally stepped up on the square to call the fight, even with Indara glaring at him and beating her fist on the ground. Elise Tolliver was declared the winner of the first tournament I got to participate in. Disappointing on one level, but still, at least it was a family member that won. And I was going to have a tape to watch over and over to study how to beat her when our time to fight each other finally came. We got lunch, for everyone who had competed, along with their guests. After hitting the showers of course. Which I had planned on doing anyways, I didn't need Grandpa to play up putting more anti-vampire stink gel on his upper lip. Lunch was buffet style of course, it was the only to feed that many people. Plenty of it as well, werewolves weren't the only ones with big appetites. Magic, chi, mana, call it what you will, but using it burns calories. And veggies weren't going to fill me up this time, I went for the meat. Salmon, roast beef, fried chicken, and 2 biscuits on top. With butter. I was planning on at least one more plate, which would have some more healthy things to eat, but to start with I wanted proteins. The dining hall was nearly as big as the floor of the arena, so we had plenty of room even if everyone was scattered along several tables, but people sat at different places between trips to the banquets tables. So they could get to chat with different people each trip. I got a few dark looks from the people I had beaten, but there was a few adults, like Uncle Dave, circulating the room to break up any confrontations before they got beyond harsh glares. Then Irving plopped down at my table with the 2 plates piled high with meat. He glacéed around at Neil, Austin, Randy, and Dare. Wolves? The boys stared, before Austin nodded. Bear? Irving nodded in return, then the 2 large boys turned their attention to what was important. The rapidly clearing plates in front of them. I look at the other 3 guys, who seems a little stunned. So, bear? Is everywhere in the Dakota thing bears? Irving looked up long enough to shake his head as he shook his head. Bears, wolves, cats. 2 kinds. Some vampires, ghouls, shamans, berserkers. He grinned, then stuffed a slice of kielbasa in his mouth, closing his eyes to appreciate the taste. Boys. They turned lunch into an eating competition. I got my second plates of salads and casserole, before filling a smaller plate with a selection of desserts. Okay, it was stacked up in 2 layers, but it was all small slices and scoops of a bit of everything and still only 1 plate. After lunch I led the way to the volleyball courts with half of my class's mates, along with my grandfather giving the last bits of food on the buffet table some last lingering looks. The old man complained as we left, but I didn't get third desserts. I don't care how fast his metabolism is, that can't be healthy. The courts were in the hotel, but above ground with some high windows, with thick glass of course, so we didn't have any vampires in attendance. Instead, it was again responsible people like Uncle Dave heading off any fights. Which was easier with everyone having a full stomach. In fact, it was another good half hour before anyone was up to play. Instead people sat around chatting or lightly dozing from their near sugar comas. As much as I was looking forward to playing a few games, I did regret not being in the arena to watch the adult tournament. I wasn't sure how much or how well I could have watched the fights, let alone pick up anything I could try out. But right now, I wanted to win something, or at least have a few other people to blame if we lost. Besides, my mom had said she was going to get the recording of the adult fights. It wouldn't be the same as seeing things with magically enhanced senses. But I would take what I could get. Eventually, it was some people from my group who stepped out first to knock the ball back and forth with 4 people on each side. Then some guys with short haircuts stepped out. I chatted with one of the girls in the lounge that was with them, since I needed a little more time to digest lunch. Turned out the guy who had been in tactical gear, Jeff, was out there playing, and his team were all part of a ROTC training program for magically enhanced people from all over the country. Some of who were members of families who had been serving in the military since the Revolutionary War. Turns out in addition to inspiring the Society of Cincinnati's, Washing had inspired a group called the Society of Spartacus. Sally, who was Jeff's sister, was also a member and planning on joining the same ROTC program when she graduated from high school. It also turned out that there was a basketball court next door. I looked around. Elise. Irving. Chain guy. Basketball. Horse if we can't get full teams. Chain guy glared at me. My name is Nigel. I waved at him. Hi Nigel. Come play. We got teams. Everyone here, other than some guests and family members, were all intensely physical people, and they wanted to burn off some calories. Elise slipped away from her dad, and I got her on my team. We got into sync pretty fast, and while we didn't get to talk, we did exchange some grins at each other as well as mocking looks when one of us missed a shot. Freaking Irving ended up on Sally's team. He could reach up 9 feet without jumping. I'm pretty sure standing between me and the basket was against some rule, but it wasn't as if I had gotten to play that often to know if he was allowed to do that or not. We, Team Near East, won the first game and narrowly beat the second game before Team ROTC rolled in. They were used to working as a team, so despite being relatively weak as magical warriors, their teamwork won that game. Plus my team was a little worn out. Energy drinks, cut veggies, fruit, and some unhealthy things like chips, cheese, and jerky had appeared in the sports lounge while we had been playing. Which refreshed me to jump into a volleyball game with another scratch team which included Neil and Irving. This time the giant was on my team. I got Elise contact info for social media sites as well as Sally's. I gave mine to Irving, as well as Nigel. He turned out to be pretty cool. He had just wanted to try out his new favorite weapon in something closer to a real fight. It was getting late by the time things broke up, but break up they did. Some people had long drives the next day or had to catch flights. So after a quick shower and some goodbyes, I was off to a supervised slumber party with the werewolves.